There's a moment that happens in archaeology, usually just after dawn, when the light is perfect and the dig site is quiet. A researcher brushes away another layer of dust, and suddenly the world tilts. What they're looking at shouldn't exist. Not here, not this early, not with this level of sophistication. It happens more often than you might think. In southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians appeared around 4500 BCE with a fully developed civilization. Not the slow build-up you'd expect, not the gradual evolution from simple to complex. They arrived in history with writing already invented, mathematics already sophisticated, astronomical observations already precise. They knew about planets that shouldn't be visible to the naked eye. They used base 60 mathematics that we still use today for measuring time and angles. Where did they learn it? The answer in textbooks is always the same. They developed it themselves. But that's not really an answer. That's just moving the question backward. How do you develop complex mathematics without simpler mathematics first? How do you build a sophisticated writing system without primitive writing preceding it? The Sumerians don't show us the ladder. They show us the top rung. In Egypt, it's even stranger. The Great Pyramid at Giza was built during the 4th dynasty, very early in Egyptian history. It remains the most precisely constructed pyramid they ever made. Every pyramid that came after was less accurate, less sophisticated, as if the knowledge was fading rather than growing. The Great Pyramid's alignment to true north is accurate to within 3/60th of a single degree. Its dimensions encode mathematical constants that supposedly weren't discovered for thousands of years. The conventional explanation is that 4th dynasty Egyptians were simply brilliant. But brilliance doesn't explain why their successors, with all that brilliance to learn from, built inferior copies. Then there's Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with sophisticated reliefs, aligned to astronomical phenomena. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, but it was built around 9600 BCE. That date should mean something to you, though we'll get to why later. What matters now is what that date represents. This complex was constructed by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet. They were hunter-gatherers. That's what we're told. But hunter-gatherers don't organize the labor to move 20-ton stones. They don't have the surplus time to carve detailed art. They don't build temples to track celestial movements they shouldn't understand. Unless they weren't really hunter-gatherers. Unless they knew things they shouldn't have known. Archaeologists don't talk about this gap in polite company. It makes them uncomfortable. They've built careers on the assumption that civilization develops slowly, predictably, linearly. But the evidence keeps whispering something else. Knowledge appears too early. Sophistication comes before simplicity. The advanced predates the primitive. In academic circles, late at night when the conferences are over and the wine has been flowing, they'll admit it quietly. Something doesn't add up. There are too many anomalies. Too many moments when they brush away the dust and find something that shouldn't be there. Too many civilizations that seem to have started at the middle instead of the beginning. The timeline we've been taught has blank spaces, uncomfortable silences, gaps where knowledge should be developing, but instead just appears, fully formed, as if someone handed it down complete. So the question haunts them, these researchers standing in the perfect morning light, staring at something impossible. Where did these first teachers come from? Listen carefully to the old stories, not the sanitized versions in children's books, but the original myths that grandparents told around fires when the world was younger and memory was longer. They all say the same thing. These ancient voices. They just use different names. The Sumerians wrote about the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the Erythraean Sea, neither fully human nor fully divine. They came before the Great Flood, these stories say, and they taught everything. How to build cities, how to write, how to read the stars, how to govern wisely. The Sumerian king lists describe them in detail, giving them names, assigning them specific knowledge domains. These weren't vague gods in the sky. These were teachers who walked among people and showed them how to become civilized. In Egypt, priests spoke of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. They came before the pharaohs, before recorded dynasties, in the time called Zep Tepi, the first time. Egyptian texts are oddly specific about this period, dating it to around 10,000 years before their own era. The Shemsu Hor weren't gods, but servants of gods, intermediaries who preserved divine knowledge through ages of chaos and taught it to the people who would build the pyramids. Cross the Atlantic, and the story repeats with different faces. In South America, they remembered Viracocha, a bearded man who appeared after a great flood. He was described as tall, light-skinned, different from the people he taught. He showed them agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. When his work was done, he walked into the Western Sea and vanished. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl played the same role, bearded, wise, arriving from the water, teaching civilization, promising to return. The pattern continues in Asia. Hindu texts describe the Saptarishi, 7 sages who preserved the Vedas through the Great Dissolution. They're credited with teaching astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and spiritual knowledge to humanity after catastrophe nearly erased everything. In China, legends tell of the Yellow Emperor descending from the heavens with knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, writing, and governance, arriving fully formed with wisdom that transformed scattered tribes into organized civilization. Picture those ancient nights. No electric lights, just firelight reflecting off faces as the elders spoke, children leaning forward, memorizing every word because this was their history, their identity, their explanation for why they lived the way they did. The grandparents would say, "We were not always like this. Once we were less." Then the teachers came. They arrived from the sea, or from the sky, or from the direction of the setting sun. They were different from us, taller, or paler, or bearded, where we were not. They taught our ancestors everything we know, and then they left. The stories are consistent in strange ways. The teachers always come after destruction, floods, fires, catastrophes that nearly ended everything. They always arrive from somewhere else, usually associated with water or distant lands. They always teach the same categories of knowledge: agriculture, astronomy, architecture, writing, governance. And they always leave, their mission complete, sometimes promising return, sometimes simply disappearing back into the mystery they came from. Different continents, different millennia, different languages and cultures that had no contact with each other. And yet, they all remembered the same strangers, just called them by different names. Historians say these are just myths, universal human storytelling patterns, psychological projections. But myths don't usually agree on details across cultures that never met. Myths don't typically provide specific timelines or technical information, and myths don't usually insist, as these stories do, that this really happened. So who were they remembering? Say the word Atlantis today, and watch what happens. Eyes roll, scholars smirk. It's been reduced to science fiction, to conspiracy theory, to the kind of thing serious people don't discuss. The name itself has become a joke, buried under centuries of speculation, fantasy novels, and pseudoscience. Maybe that's the greatest trick history ever played. Take something real and make it so ridiculous that no one dares examine it seriously. But what if that's exactly what happened? Not the mockery we created, but the process itself. What if a real place, a real catastrophe, a real diaspora of survivors became so mythologized over thousands of years that truth drowned beneath the waves of its own story? Plato wrote about Atlantis in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE. The conventional wisdom is that he invented it as a philosophical metaphor, a cautionary tale about hubris and divine punishment. But read what he actually wrote. The detail is strange for fiction. He doesn't just describe a vague lost civilization. He provides a date, 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, which places the destruction around 9600 BCE. He describes a specific location, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the Atlantic Ocean. He details the political structure. 10 kingdoms, ruled by descendants of Poseidon, meeting regularly to govern collectively. He describes the architecture, concentric rings of water and land, hot and cold springs, mountains to the north, a fertile plain to the south. That's a lot of precision for a made-up story meant to illustrate abstract philosophy. Plato insisted he got this from Solon, who got it from Egyptian priests at Sais. The priests supposedly mocked Greek historical memory as infantile, saying they had records stretching back far longer. They told Solon about a mighty maritime civilization that once controlled lands across the Mediterranean and beyond, before violent earthquakes and floods destroyed it in a single day and night. Here's what makes it interesting. That date Plato gave, 9600 BCE, matches the end of the Younger Dryas period, a time of catastrophic climate change when Ice Age conditions ended abruptly. Sea levels rose dramatically, and coastlines worldwide drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. It was a real event. Geological fact. The timing isn't random. So what if Atlantis isn't the cartoon we imagine? What if it's just our name for something that really existed? A maritime civilization at the end of the Ice Age, advanced for its time, destroyed by the same climate catastrophe that geological records confirm? What if those Sumerian Apkallu, those Egyptian Shemsu Hor, those South American teachers weren't separate legends but the same people? Survivors scattering from a destroyed homeland, carrying their knowledge to distant shores. The Apkallu came from the sea. Viracocha appeared after floods. The Egyptian first time followed catastrophe. The timing matches. The stories match. The knowledge they brought, astronomy, architecture, agriculture, mathematics, matches what a sophisticated maritime culture would possess. What if every civilization we call ancient was actually built on older foundations we haven't recognized? What if they weren't inventing knowledge, but remembering it, preserving fragments of wisdom that survived catastrophe? What if the story we dismissed as fantasy was the only account that actually told the truth about where human civilization really came from? The name became a joke. But names are just sounds we make. The pattern beneath the name remains, waiting in the myths, encoded in the monuments, whispered in the stories every culture told about the teachers who came before. To understand if they built what we call history, we first need to know who they were. Strip away the interpretations. Forget the speculation. Set aside what others have claimed Plato meant. Just read what he actually wrote. Around 360 BCE, Plato composed two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In them, he describes something extraordinary. The story comes through a chain of transmission. Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker, traveled to Egypt around 570 BCE. In the city of Sais, he met with priests who kept records stretching back thousands of years. These priests did something unexpected. They mocked him. Greek memory, they said, was infantile. You know nothing of true antiquity, they told him. Your floods and catastrophes erase your history every few generations, leaving you to start again like children. Then they told him about something older. 9,000 years before their own time, the priest said, there existed a powerful civilization. Calculate that date forward, and you arrive at approximately 9600 BCE, right at the boundary between the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs, right at the end of the last ice age. Plato recorded this date, not a vague, long ago, but a specific timeline. The priests described an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. This island, they said, was larger than Libya and Asia combined. Its capital city was built in concentric circles, alternating rings of land and water connected by bridges and tunnels. At the center stood temples and palaces. The city had both hot and cold springs. Mountains rose to the north, providing shelter. To the south stretched a vast rectangular plain, incredibly fertile, irrigated by channels that brought water from the mountains. Plato provides measurements. The plain was 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia. The outer ring of water was 3 stadia wide. The inner rings were progressively smaller. These aren't the gestures of allegory. This is the precision of someone describing a real place. The political structure was equally specific. 10 kingdoms, each ruled by a king descended from Poseidon's lineage. The kings met regularly to discuss governance, to judge disputes, to make collective decisions. They followed ancient laws inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum. a metal Plato describes as glowing like fire, valued second only to gold. Modern scholars debate what orichalcum might have been, perhaps an alloy now lost, perhaps brass, perhaps something we no longer recognize. The civilization was maritime. It controlled territories across the Mediterranean. It had established colonies, built ports, commanded trade routes. It wasn't isolated, but connected to the wider world through its naval power. And then came destruction. Plato is specific about this too. Violent earthquakes, overwhelming floods. The island sank beneath the ocean in a single day and night. The timeline, approximately 9600 BCE. Here's what's strange about allegory. It doesn't usually require such precision. When Plato invented other philosophical metaphors, he kept them abstract. The cave allegory doesn't specify the cave's dimensions. The ring of Gyges doesn't provide geographical coordinates. But Atlantis gets dates, measurements, political structures, architectural details, and a specific method of destruction. The traditional interpretation is that Plato invented this as a cautionary tale about hubris, about a civilization that grew arrogant and faced divine punishment. But why invent such elaborate detail for a simple moral lesson? Why ground it in a conversation with Egyptian priests? Why insist, as Plato does through his characters, that this story is true? Scholars have debated this for millennia. Some say it was all fiction. Others argue that Plato might have been describing a real place, but exaggerating its details. Still others suggest he was combining multiple historical memories. Perhaps the Minoan eruption at Thera. Perhaps other Mediterranean disasters. But none of these explanations quite account for that date. 9600 BCE. Specific. Unambiguous. Given without caveat. He gave the date, the location, the destruction. Why would a philosopher need such precision for a myth? But could any of this be real? Picture Earth 12,000 years ago. The world you're imagining is completely wrong. The coastlines weren't where they are now. Sea levels sat 400 feet lower than today. What we call ocean floor was dry land. The Persian Gulf didn't exist. It was a fertile river valley. The Mediterranean coast extended miles beyond its current borders. Indonesia wasn't islands, but a vast subcontinent called Sundaland. Britain connected to Europe through Doggerland, a populated plain now beneath the North Sea. This was the world of the late Pleistocene, the tail end of the last ice age. Massive ice sheets covered northern latitudes. Megafauna, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, roamed continents. And humans, anatomically identical to us, lived along those ancient coastlines, in the river valleys, on the fertile plains that no longer exist above water. Then something happened around 9600 BCE. Temperatures spiked. Ice sheets collapsed. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose rapidly, catastrophically, drowning coastlines worldwide within decades. The Younger Dryas period, a brief return to glacial conditions, ended abruptly. Some researchers propose this wasn't gradual warming, but triggered catastrophe, possibly comet fragments striking North America and Europe causing atmospheric chaos, continent-wide wildfires, extinction events. The evidence remains controversial, but something dramatic definitely occurred. The geological record is clear about the result. Massive flooding, coastlines retreating inland at speeds that would have been visible within human lifetimes, entire landscapes vanishing beneath rising waters. This wasn't myth. This was real, measurable, global catastrophe. Now ask yourself, if advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age, where would they have built? The answer is obvious. Coastlines, river mouths, fertile valleys with access to water. The same places humans have always built. The same places that are now hundreds of feet underwater. We've barely looked there. Ocean archaeology is expensive, technologically challenging, and until recently, largely impossible. But in the last few decades, as technology improved, divers have started finding things. Structures off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, geometric formations that some argue are clearly artificial. Submerged ruins off the coast of Gujarat in India, dated to potentially 9,000 years old. Unusual formations near Cuba, in the Mediterranean, off the coast of numerous continents. Are these natural formations? Ancient harbors? Something older? The scientific community remains divided. Many of these sites are controversial, their artificial nature disputed, but they prove something important. We haven't been looking in the right places. If Ice Age civilizations existed, their remains are exactly where we'd expect. Underwater, unexplored, buried under silt and coral, and 12,000 years of marine growth. Consider the flood myths. Every ancient culture has them. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim surviving a great flood in a boat. The biblical Noah, the Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Manu, Native American tribes across both continents, Aboriginal Australian stories, Chinese legends. These stories span disconnected cultures, separated by oceans, with no contact with each other. Yet they all remember the same event: catastrophic floods, rising waters, survival by boat, landing on mountains, humanity beginning again. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these as universal psychological archetypes. Human imagination creating similar stories independently. But what if there's something simpler? What if they're memory? What if scattered survivors of the coastal flooding carried these stories inland, passed them down through generations? And those stories became the foundation myths of the civilizations we call ancient. If you lived on those drowning coastlines, if you watched the waters rise year after year, decade after decade, swallowing everything your ancestors built, you'd remember it. Your children would remember. Their children would remember. The story would be told around fires for thousands of years, once we lived by the great waters. But they rose and took everything, and we fled to higher ground. That's what the myths describe. Not fantasy, not divine punishment, just catastrophe, survival, and memory. The oceans rose 400 feet. We've only just started looking at what they buried. But even if a civilization existed then, how advanced could they really have been? Göbekli Tepe sits on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. When archaeologists first excavated it in the 1990s, they found massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles. Sophisticated carvings covered the stones. Animals, symbols, geometric patterns. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and the date was impossible. 9600 BCE, exactly when Plato said Atlantis was destroyed. According to every textbook, civilization began with agriculture around 8000 BCE. First, humans learned to farm. Then, with reliable food surplus, they developed specialized labor. Then came architecture, writing, organized religion, and astronomy. The progression was supposed to be slow, linear, logical. Göbekli Tepe shatters that timeline. It predates agriculture. It was built by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked the organization, motivation, and technical knowledge for such construction. Yet here it stands. 20-ton pillars, sophisticated carving, astronomical alignments, evidence of complex society. The paradigm doesn't just bend, it breaks. And that's just the beginning. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns to true north within 3/60ths of a single degree. Try that yourself. Try aligning anything that precisely using only tools available in 2500 BCE. The pyramid's base is leveled within inches across 13 acres. Its dimensions encode pi, phi, and the speed of light when measured in specific units. The three Giza pyramids mirror the constellation Orion's belt, but not as it appeared when they were supposedly built. As it appeared around 10,500 BCE, the Sumerians knew about precession, Earth's axial wobble that takes 26,000 years to complete. How do you discover something that takes longer to observe than civilizations typically last? They also described planets not visible to the naked eye. Their mathematics used base 60, so sophisticated we still use it for time and navigation. Where did they learn this? The Peary Race map, drawn in 1513, shows Antarctica's coastline. Not the ice-covered version we know, but the actual rock coastline beneath the ice. That coast wasn't seen by modern explorers until ground-penetrating radar mapped it in the 1950s. Yet there it sits on a Renaissance map, with a notation that it was copied from much older source maps. The cartographer didn't know what he was drawing. He was just copying what ancient charts showed. These aren't fringe claims. These are documented facts that make academics uncomfortable because they don't fit the established timeline. Advanced knowledge appears too early. Sophisticated understanding precedes the supposed development of that sophistication. The standard explanation is independent invention. Each civilization figured it out separately. But independent invention doesn't explain identical mathematical constants appearing in disconnected cultures. It doesn't explain astronomical knowledge that requires multi-generational observation programs appearing suddenly. It doesn't explain architectural precision that we struggle to match with modern tools. There's another explanation. What if knowledge wasn't invented but inherited? What if scattered survivors from an older civilization carried their understanding to different regions. Astronomical observations collected over millennia, mathematical principles developed through centuries of study, architectural techniques refined through generations of practice. This knowledge wouldn't arrive as complete technological civilization. Tools break, infrastructure collapses, populations dwindle. But the ideas could survive. The concepts could be taught. A survivor teaching coastal navigation might not be able to build a ship to their old standards, but they could teach the mathematics of celestial navigation. An astronomer's descendant might not remember why their ancestors tracked the stars, but they could preserve the observations. An engineer's grandchild might not rebuild the old cities, but they could teach the principles of precise construction. This would explain the pattern. Knowledge appearing fully formed. Sophistication without visible development. Similar concepts across disconnected cultures. Not because aliens visited, or because humans are telepathic, but because all these civilizations learned from the same teachers. Scattered survivors carrying remnants of older wisdom. They knew things they hadn't had time to discover, unless someone taught them. But if they did teach the world, we would expect to find their footprints everywhere. Egyptian civilization appeared in history like a magic trick. One moment, scattered settlements along the Nile. The next, a fully unified kingdom with sophisticated writing, monumental architecture, complex theology, and astronomical precision that still impresses modern engineers. Around 3100 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt unified under the first pharaoh, Narmer, also called Menes. And immediately, not gradually, not over centuries, but immediately, we see hieroglyphic writing fully developed, massive stone structures precisely built, religious systems elaborately organized, and calendars accurately tracking celestial movements. Where's the learning curve? Where's the trial and error? Where are the primitive attempts that precede mastery? They're not there. Egyptian civilization didn't crawl. It walked out of prehistory fully formed, as if someone had already taught them everything they needed to know. The Egyptians themselves offered an explanation. They spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked among humans and taught them the arts of civilization. This wasn't vague mythology. Egyptian texts dated Zep-Tepi specifically, 10 to 12,000 years before their own era. That places it right around 10,000 BCE, right around the time Plato said Atlantis was destroyed. The Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus list dynasties of rulers before the historical pharaohs. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses these as mythological, symbolic reigns of gods who never existed. But the lists contain oddly specific information. Names, lengths of rule, succession orders. These don't read like creation myths. They read like king lists, the same type of chronicle used for historical pharaohs, just extended backward into impossibly deep time. Then there are the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus. Egyptian tradition describes them as a mysterious group who ruled between the divine age and the historical dynasties. Not gods themselves, but preservers of divine knowledge. Intermediaries who maintained ancient wisdom through turbulent ages and passed it to those who would build the pyramids. If survivors from an older civilization sought refuge in Egypt, spending thousands of years slowly teaching and integrating with locals, the Shemsu-Hor legends might be exactly how that history would be remembered. The Sphinx presents its own mystery. Traditional dating places it around 2500 BCE, contemporary with Khafra's pyramid. But geologists examining the Sphinx enclosure have noted something peculiar. Deep vertical erosion patterns consistent with rainfall, not wind and sand. Egypt's been arid for 5,000 years. When was it last wet enough to cause such erosion? Around 10,000 BCE, during the wetter climate period at the end of the Ice Age. Egyptian astronomy was sophisticated from the start. Their calendar, established in the very first dynasties, was more accurate than calendars used in Europe thousands of years later. They tracked Sirius's heliacal rising with precision, understanding the Sothic cycle that takes over 1,400 years to complete. They aligned temples and pyramids to specific stars with accuracy that requires multi-generational observation programs. This knowledge appears complete in the earliest dynasties, as if inherited rather than developed. The Nile Valley would have been an ideal refuge, protected by deserts on both sides, fed by a river that flooded predictably, isolated enough to rebuild in peace, yet fertile enough to support growing populations. If survivors from the drowned coastlines sought shelter, they'd choose places like this. Safe harbors where knowledge could be preserved, where teaching could span generations, where the old wisdom could be carefully integrated with local culture until the two became inseparable. Imagine them arriving after the waters rose, carrying what remained of their astronomical observations, their mathematical understanding, their architectural principles, finding people already living along the Nile, hunter-gatherers and early farmers, not conquering them, teaching them, intermarrying with them, slowly, carefully, over thousands of years, transferring knowledge. The survivors' children teaching their children, who taught theirs, generation after generation, until the origins blurred into myth, until the teachers became gods, until history became religion. By the time Egypt unified under Nama, the preparation was complete. The knowledge had been preserved, tested, refined through millennia of patient transmission. What looks like sudden emergence was actually gradual accumulation finally becoming visible. Egypt didn't learn to build pyramids. They remembered how. But were they the only ones? Southern Mesopotamia, around 4500 BCE. Small Ubaid villages scatter across the river plains. Simple pottery. Basic agriculture. Then, almost overnight in historical terms, Sumer, sophisticated city-states, complex irrigation networks, cylinder seals, proto-cuneiform writing, advanced mathematics, astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. No gradual transition. No archaeological evidence of slow development, just sudden appearance of civilization, fully equipped with the tools of organized society. The Sumerians knew this was strange. They wrote about it. Their texts describe the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the Erythraean Sea, what we call the Persian Gulf. These weren't gods. The descriptions are specific. They had human bodies but wore fish-like garments, perhaps describing something like diving suits or ritual costumes. They came before the Great Flood, the texts say, and they taught everything. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, governance. The systematic knowledge required to transform scattered tribes into urban civilization. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 300 BCE, preserved detailed accounts of these teachers. He listed their names, described what each one taught, emphasized that they came from the water and that they appeared specifically to educate humanity. This wasn't myth added later to explain forgotten origins. The Sumerians were writing about their teachers while their civilization was thriving, maintaining oral traditions of actual events that shaped their society. The Sumerian king list offers another oddity. It describes kingship before the flood, with rulers reigning for impossibly long periods. Then came the deluge. After the waters receded, the text says, kingship descended from heaven again. This mirrors the pattern we've seen. Catastrophe, survival, rebuilding, knowledge transmitted from those who came before. Consider Sumerian mathematics. They used base 60, a number system so sophisticated we still use it for measuring time and angles. They understood place value, a concept that wouldn't reach Europe until medieval times. They could calculate square and cube roots. Their astronomical observations tracked planetary movements with precision that required centuries of careful record-keeping. They knew about the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis, taking 26,000 years to complete. How does a civilization just appearing in history possess knowledge that requires multi-generational observation to discover? Their astronomy extended beyond what naked eyes should see. Sumerian texts reference celestial bodies that weren't officially discovered until telescopes made them visible. Their mathematical sophistication enabled predictions of eclipses and planetary positions. This wasn't primitive stargazing. This was advanced astronomy, as if they'd inherited observations compiled over millennia. Then there's the linguistic mystery. Sumerian is a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family. It doesn't fit with the Semitic languages that surrounded it. It doesn't connect to Indo-European roots. It stands alone, suggesting its speakers didn't evolve locally, but arrived from somewhere else, bringing their strange tongue with them. The Persian Gulf Basin offers a clue. During the Ice Age, it wasn't water, but a fertile river valley, fed by 4 rivers converging at its center. That's exactly what Sumerian texts describe. A paradise with 4 rivers before the flood came and swallowed it. Then sea levels rose, drowning that valley, turning it into the Persian Gulf. Survivors fleeing north would have found the Mesopotamian river valleys, carried their knowledge with them, encountered local peoples, and begun teaching. The Apkallu emerging from the sea takes on literal meaning if they were refugees from drowning coastlines, arriving by boat. Their fish garments, perhaps actual maritime gear, or the ceremonial dress commemorating their oceanic origins. They came from the water, not as supernatural beings, but as survivors of a maritime civilization, carrying what remained of their sophisticated understanding. Why would the Sumerians invent teachers if they could claim divine inspiration? Why not say the gods gave them civilization directly? Why specifically describe mortal sages who came from elsewhere and taught them? The simplest explanation is that they described what actually happened. Wise strangers arrived from the south, from the direction of the vanished valley, and systematically educated them in the arts of civilization. The Sumerians wrote that wise men came from the sea and taught them everything. Maybe they were just telling the truth. But what about the other side of the world? This territory is dangerous. The legends of bearded teachers in the Americas have been twisted, misused, weaponized by conquistadors justifying genocide, by racist pseudoscience denying indigenous achievement, by every agenda that wanted to diminish native accomplishment. That misuse was real and harmful. But misuse doesn't automatically mean the underlying traditions are fiction. Sometimes truth gets buried under both denial and exploitation, and recovering it requires careful, respectful examination. The stories exist across the Americas, consistent in strange ways. Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, described as bearded, unusual for indigenous Americans, who typically lack heavy facial hair. He taught agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, writing, and architecture. Then he departed eastward across the ocean, promising eventual return. That promise, tragically, contributed to Aztec hesitation when bearded Spaniards arrived from the east, interpreting them as the prophesied return. Viracocha in South America, also described as bearded and light-skinned. He appeared after a great flood, found the ancestors of the Inca, taught them the foundations of civilization, then walked into the Western Sea and vanished. The details mirror Quetzalcoatl, despite originating in cultures separated by thousands of miles. These aren't vague creator gods. The myths contain specific details. Arrival from the sea, usually from the east. Appearance after floods. Teaching practical skills, not performing miracles. And departure, not death, with the teachers explicitly leaving back across the water they came from. The advanced knowledge in American civilizations matches these teaching legends. The Maya developed a zero concept independently, something only a handful of civilizations ever achieved. Their astronomical calendar was more accurate than the Julian calendar Europeans used into the 1500s. They tracked Venus's cycle with precision matching modern calculations. Teotihuacan's layout encodes sophisticated astronomical alignments. Tiwanaku and Sacsayhuaman display stone-cutting precision that modern tools struggle to replicate, with blocks fitted so exactly that blades can't slip between them. Agricultural innovations supported populations rivaling contemporary Europe. Chinampas, artificial islands optimizing crop production, demonstrated understanding of hydrology and soil science. Terracing systems in Peru created microclimates, enabling diverse crops at different elevations. These weren't lucky accidents, but systematic applications of sophisticated knowledge. The architectural similarities are striking. Stepped pyramids appear in Mesoamerica and in Egypt, despite no supposed contact. Similar astronomical concepts in American and Old World civilizations. Compatible mathematical systems. Even curious linguistic coincidences that linguists struggle to explain away. If Atlantean survivors scattered from a central Atlantic location when their homeland drowned, some would inevitably reach American shores. The Atlantic currents and wind patterns make such voyages feasible. People had crossed the Atlantic millennia before Columbus. Vikings proved that, reaching Newfoundland around 1000 CE. If it was possible in longships, It was possible in whatever vessels Ice Age maritime peoples possessed. Imagine these survivors making landfall on American coasts. They'd encounter indigenous peoples who'd crossed the Bering Land Bridge, already established across 2 continents. The survivors wouldn't conquer. They were refugees, likely small groups, seeking shelter, not empire. They'd share what they knew. Their astronomical observations, mathematical understanding, architectural principles. They'd intermarry, contribute their knowledge while adopting local culture, their distinctive appearance preserved in memory even as they genetically integrated over generations. Over millennia, these encounters would transform into legend. The teacher's foreign origins, their bearded appearance unusual in these populations, their arrival from the Eastern Sea, the knowledge they brought, all would be preserved in oral tradition, passed down through thousands of years, eventually becoming the foundation myths that Spanish conquistadors later encountered and misinterpreted. This explains both the advanced knowledge appearing in American civilizations and the consistent legends. Not aliens, not mysterious lost tribes of Israel, just human survivors from a maritime culture, carrying remnants of sophisticated understanding, teaching what they remembered to people they met, contributing to civilizations that would develop their own unique brilliance while incorporating fragments of older wisdom. Every culture from Mexico to Peru remembered the same story. Teachers who came from where Atlantis would have been. But if they scattered so far, teaching in Egypt, Sumer, the Americas, if their influence spread globally, did they have a plan? The Great Pyramid of Giza sits at latitude 29.9792458 degrees north. That number should sound familiar. It's the speed of light, 299,792,458 meters per second. The pyramid's location encodes the exact speed at which light travels through space, expressed in the same units we use today. Coincidence? Perhaps. Except it's not alone. Take the pyramid's dimensions. The ratio of its perimeter to its height is exactly 2 pi. The base perimeter equals the circumference of a circle whose radius is the pyramid's height. These aren't approximate. These are precise mathematical relationships encoded in stone 4,000 years ago, supposedly by people who hadn't discovered pi yet. But the strangeness doesn't stop at Giza. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, built thousands of years after the pyramids by a completely different civilization with supposedly no contact, mirrors the Giza Plateau's layout. Not identically, but mathematically. The temple complex encodes astronomical data in its dimensions, distances to the sun and moon at specific scales, the length of the precession cycle, the number of days in 4 different yugas from Hindu cosmology. The builders carved these numbers into architecture, making the entire temple a 3-dimensional cosmic calendar. Teotihuacan in Mexico follows similar principles. The major monuments align to specific stars. The layout encodes precise measurements of planetary distances in the solar system, using scales that convert architectural measurements into astronomical ones. The Avenue of the Dead points to the setting point of the Pleiades when the city was built. Plot these sites on a globe. Add Easter Island. Add Petra. Add Tiwanaku. Add ancient sites from every continent. Now draw lines connecting them. The distances aren't random. They follow geometric patterns, specific mathematical relationships, precise ratios, as if someone planned a global network, calculating exact locations based on Earth's geometry, establishing teaching centers at predetermined points. The Nazca lines in Peru sprawl across the desert, some formations so large they only make sense from the air. One line points directly to the winter solstice sunrise. Another, when extended, points toward Giza. The geoglyphs weren't meant to be seen from the ground. They were meant to be mapped, their alignments calculated, their geometric relationships preserved in the landscape itself. Researchers mapping these connections have found something remarkable. The sites form a pattern, not vague similarities, but precise mathematical relationships. The distances between them encode the same constants: pi, phi, the square root of 2. The alignments track the same astronomical phenomena: solstices, equinoxes, precession, planetary movements. This isn't mysticism. This is mathematics speaking across millennia. If survivors scattered globally after catastrophe, and if their primary goal was preserving knowledge, they'd need a system that outlasted written language, that survived cultural collapse, that remained readable even if civilization regressed to primitive conditions. What better system than architecture itself? Build monuments at calculated locations, encode mathematical constants in their dimensions, align them to astronomical phenomena, make the structures so massive, so precisely built, so clearly intentional that future civilizations couldn't miss them. Each site becomes a library, not of words, but of numbers. The Great Pyramid preserves pi, phi, Earth's dimensions, the speed of light. Angkor Wat encodes astronomical cycles and cosmic periods. Teotihuacan maps the solar system. The Nazca lines create ground-level star charts. Different civilizations, different expressions, but the same fundamental knowledge encoded into permanent architecture. Picture the planners in the aftermath. Master astronomers, mathematicians, engineers. They've watched their civilization drown. They understand how quickly knowledge disappears. So they create a backup system, calculate precise locations based on Earth's geometry, establish schools at each site, build monuments encoding essential knowledge, ensure that even if everything else is lost, writing, technology, cultural memory, the mathematics persists in stone. They weren't building temples. They were building hard drives, indestructible, permanent, waiting for future civilizations to develop the mathematics necessary to decode what's written there. And the sites are still talking, still broadcasting their mathematical messages, waiting for us to fully understand the language they're speaking. They're all talking to each other in the language of mathematics. But how did they coordinate across such distances without modern technology? We imagine ancient peoples as isolated, trapped by geography, unable to cross vast oceans. We picture civilizations developing independently, separated by insurmountable distances. We assume maritime technology was primitive, that crossing oceans was impossible until relatively modern times. We're wrong about all of it. The Polynesians navigated thousands of miles of open Pacific without instruments. They read wave patterns, watched bird migrations, tracked star paths, felt ocean swells, passed navigational knowledge through generations of oral teaching. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, tiny specks in the world's largest ocean, centuries before European ships discovered them. If humans could navigate the Pacific without compasses or charts, why assume they couldn't cross the Atlantic? The evidence suggests they did. Often, Egyptian mummies contain traces of cocaine and tobacco. Both plants are native only to the Americas. They didn't exist in the Old World before Columbus. Yet there they are, in mummies predating any supposed contact by thousands of years. The standard explanation is contamination, modern handling, false positives. But the tests have been repeated, verified, replicated. Something doesn't fit. The Peary race map, drawn in 1513, shows Antarctica's coastline with remarkable accuracy. Not the ice we see today, but the actual rock beneath, matching modern ground-penetrating radar surveys. The cartographer noted he compiled it from older source maps, some ancient. How did pre-modern maps show a coastline supposedly not seen until the 1950s? Vikings reached North America around 1000 CE. We found their settlements in Newfoundland, proving Europeans crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus. If it was possible in Viking longships, it was possible in whatever vessels earlier maritime peoples possessed. The Phoenicians, master sailors of the ancient Mediterranean, allegedly circumnavigated Africa around 600 BCE, according to Herodotus. They departed westward from the Red Sea, sailed south down the African coast, rounded the Cape, and returned through the Pillars of Hercules 3 years later. European ships wouldn't repeat that voyage for 2,000 years. Roman coins turn up in North America. Chinese anchors lie off California's coast. Celtic Ogham script appears carved on stones in New England. Each discovery is controversial. Each has mainstream explanations: hoaxes, misidentifications, modern contamination. But collectively, they suggest more ancient transoceanic contact than officially acknowledged. The ocean currents themselves tell a story. The North Atlantic current flows from the Mediterranean toward the Caribbean. Trade winds enable return journeys. These aren't speculative routes. These are actual, navigable highways that ancient sailors could have followed, would have followed, if they possessed the maritime capability. And if Atlantis was a maritime civilization in the Atlantic, they would have possessed that capability. Advanced shipbuilding, sophisticated navigation, generational knowledge of currents and winds. When catastrophe struck and their homeland drowned, scattered survivors wouldn't be isolated. They'd maintain contact. They'd coordinate. They'd need to. Picture the ancient maritime network. Regular routes between teaching centers. Ships carrying not just trade goods, but knowledge. Priests traveling to share astronomical observations. Astronomers coordinating calendar systems. Teachers moving between schools to ensure consistency. This wouldn't be random drift voyages, but deliberate navigation, maintaining the connection between scattered survivor communities. Over centuries, the network would weaken. Ships would be lost. Routes would be forgotten. Storms, wars, and cultural changes would disrupt contact. But traces would persist. Myths of gods arriving from the sea. architectural similarities across oceans, shared astronomical knowledge in disconnected civilizations, the occasional artifact in the wrong place at the wrong time, suggesting contact that shouldn't have happened. The Phoenicians remembered sea routes to distant lands. The Irish legends speak of voyages to western lands across the ocean. Polynesian traditions describe deliberate exploration voyages spanning generations. Chinese records mention expeditions to eastern shores. These aren't fantasies. These are maritime cultures doing what maritime cultures do: sailing, exploring, trading, connecting. The ocean wasn't a barrier separating civilizations. It was infrastructure connecting them, a highway system written in current and wind, navigable by people who understood how to read the water's language. Ancient peoples weren't primitive or isolated. They were sailors, and sailors sail. The evidence is there, in mummies and maps, in coins and carvings, in legends and linguistics. We just stopped looking because we assumed it was impossible. The ocean wasn't a barrier. It was their highway. But what exactly were they trying to preserve? After catastrophe destroyed everything they'd built, the survivors faced a choice. What knowledge matters most? What must be preserved at any cost? Their answers shaped everything that followed. Astronomy came first. Every ancient culture tracked celestial movements with obsessive precision, not just for planting seasons. The detail goes far beyond agricultural necessity. The Maya calculated Venus's cycle to within hours of modern measurements. The Sumerians understood precession, Earth's 26,000-year axial wobble. The Egyptians aligned their monuments to stars with accuracy requiring multi-generational observation programs. Why this obsession with the sky? Because astronomical knowledge proves sophistication. It requires patience, record-keeping, mathematical ability, institutional continuity. It's knowledge that takes millennia to develop. If you want future generations to understand that advanced civilization existed before them, encode astronomy everywhere. Make it undeniable. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates how seriously they took this. A Greek device from 100 BCE, essentially an analog computer tracking astronomical cycles. Gears calculated planetary positions, predicted eclipses, displayed multiple calendars simultaneously. Nothing comparable existed for 1,500 years after its creation. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a remnant of preserved knowledge. Mathematics came second. The golden ratio appears everywhere. The Great Pyramid, the Parthenon, Gothic cathedrals, human faces, flower spirals, shell patterns. Ancient builders encoded phi obsessively, as if it were sacred. Pi shows up in Egyptian architecture before Greeks supposedly discovered it. Pythagoras' theorem appears in Babylonian tablets predating Pythagoras by a millennium. These aren't primitive peoples accidentally stumbling onto mathematical constants. This is deliberate preservation, encoding fundamental truths into permanent structures. If books burn and languages die, the mathematics remains. Measure the pyramid, discover pi. Analyze the temple, find phi. The knowledge is there, waiting. Construction techniques were third. Megalithic architecture that modern engineers struggle to replicate appears across disconnected cultures. Sacsayhuaman stones fit so precisely that paper can't slide between them. Baalbek's foundation blocks weigh over 800 tons each, larger than anything we could move today without specialized equipment. Giza's precision across 13 acres remains unmatched. This wasn't showing off. This was teaching. Build something so impossibly precise that future civilizations must ask how it was done. The question preserves the knowledge that such precision was once possible, once understood, once achievable. The monuments become proof that sophisticated engineering existed, even if the specific techniques were lost. Finally came the esoteric, the mystery schools. Egyptian temples had initiation chambers. Greek Eleusinian mysteries guarded secret teachings. Vedic schools in India. Taoist traditions in China. All maintained similar patterns. Knowledge transmitted orally, reserved for initiates, protected by ritual and secrecy. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was sophisticated knowledge management. After watching their civilization destroy itself, survivors understood something crucial. Technical knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. So they encoded not just what to know, but how to think. Not just formulas, but judgment. Not just techniques, but ethics. Astronomy disguised as astrology. Chemistry hidden in alchemy. Psychology embedded in mythology. The encoding served dual purposes: protection and preservation. Protect dangerous knowledge from those who'd misuse it. Preserve essential knowledge through cultural memory that survives when texts burn. The mystery schools weren't teaching magic. They were teaching mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, encoded in symbolic form that required years of training to decode, ensuring students developed not just knowledge, but the wisdom to use it properly. They understood something we've forgotten. Information without context is worthless. Knowledge without ethics is dangerous, and technique without wisdom destroys everything. So they didn't just preserve formulas. They preserved frameworks for thinking, methods for learning, systems for cultivating judgment alongside capability. They didn't write it down because books burn. They wrote it in stone, in ritual, in secrets that would outlive any empire. But could such an ambitious plan really work? Or did something else happen? Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened. Not in one place. Everywhere at once. Within a few decades, virtually every major civilization in the Mediterranean and Near East collapsed. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece fell into darkness. Egyptian power crumbled. Ugarit burned. Troy fell. Trade networks that had connected continents for centuries simply stopped functioning. This is the Bronze Age collapse, and it's one of history's greatest mysteries. What's remarkable isn't just that these civilizations fell, it's how completely they fell. Writing systems disappeared. Architectural knowledge vanished. Even pottery quality declined sharply. Within 2 generations, sophisticated societies with complex administration, international trade, and refined craftsmanship had regressed to conditions resembling primitive villages. The knowledge didn't just decline, it was forgotten. People living in the ruins of Mycenaean palaces couldn't read the linear B tablets scattered around them. The skill was gone, the teachers dead, the institutional memory erased. This wasn't the only time. When Rome fell, Europe plunged into centuries where literacy became rare. Monumental architecture ceased, and administrative capabilities that had managed an empire were lost. The aqueducts crumbled because no one remembered how to maintain them. The roads degraded because the engineering knowledge disappeared. For generations, people lived among ruins they couldn't replicate, evidence of sophistication they no longer possessed. The Library of Alexandria burned. How many times we're not even certain. Thousands of texts from cultures we now know only by reference, containing knowledge accumulated over centuries, simply gone. Smoke and ash. What we've recovered is fragments, references in surviving works, hints of lost wisdom. These are collapses we can document. But how many others happen deeper in time, before writing, before recorded history, leaving no trace except the sudden disappearance of sophisticated artifacts from the archaeological record? The geological record suggests Earth itself periodically resets civilizations. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes comet fragments striking Earth around 10,800 BCE, triggering climate chaos and extinction events. Magnetic pole reversals recorded in rock layers indicate the planet's magnetic field occasionally flips, potentially devastating any civilization dependent on navigation or electrical systems. Massive flood deposits worldwide suggest periodic catastrophic flooding far beyond normal cycles. Ancient traditions seem to remember this pattern. Hindu cosmology describes yugas, vast cycles where civilization rises to golden ages, then descends through silver, bronze, and iron ages into collapse before beginning again. Greek myths tell the same story. Ages of gold, silver, bronze, iron, each ending in catastrophe. Native American prophecies speak of the current world as the fifth, after 4 previous worlds were destroyed by different catastrophes. What if they're not mythology? What if they're history? Consider an unsettling possibility. What if Atlantis itself wasn't the beginning? What if the knowledge they possessed was already ancient when they had it, recovered from previous collapses, preserved and rebuilt after earlier catastrophes? This would explain the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge, not slow development, but rediscovery, fragments of previous civilizations' wisdom, remembered and reconstructed. Each time civilization falls, survivors scramble to preserve what they can. Some knowledge survives. Much is lost. The next iteration begins with fragments, building on remnants, rediscovering old truths they think are new. The survivors become the teachers, the wise ones who remember before the collapse, passing down what remains until their origins fade into myth. Picture it across deep time. Countless rises and falls. Each civilization convinced it's the first, unaware it's walking paths carved by forgotten predecessors. Each discovery, possibly a rediscovery. Each achievement potentially an ancient accomplishment remembered. The pattern repeats. Rise, sophistication, hubris, collapse, survival, teaching, rebuilding, rise again. The Atlanteans might have been walking such a path themselves, building on knowledge inherited from collapses before theirs, thinking themselves original when they were actually continuing a cycle already ancient. What if we've forgotten this before? Many times before. So how do we know which collapse we're in? How many times has this happened? In 1936, excavators near Baghdad found unusual terracotta jars dating to around 250 BCE. Inside each jar, a copper cylinder surrounding an iron rod, sealed with asphalt. When researchers filled replicas with acidic liquid, they generated electrical current. The Baghdad battery, as it's called, appears to be a primitive electrochemical cell, suggesting knowledge of electricity 2,000 years before Franklin's kite. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical. Perhaps they were used for electroplating, or perhaps the interpretation is completely wrong, but the possibility lingers. In 1898, a wooden bird was found in an Egyptian tomb at Saqqara, dated to around 200 BCE. Small, carved, wings spread. For decades it sat in museum storage, labeled as a bird figurine. Then aeronautical engineers examined it and noticed something odd. The proportions match a glider. The wing shape provides lift. The vertical tail provides stability, a feature birds don't have but aircraft need. The Saqqara bird looks exactly like a scale model of an airplane. Ancient Indian Vimana texts describe flying machines in remarkable detail. Dimensions, materials, fuel sources, control mechanisms, metallurgical formulas for constructing heat-resistant alloys, navigation systems. The texts read less like mythology and more like technical manuals for aircraft, written thousands of years before powered flight supposedly began. At the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, Egypt, reliefs show peculiar images. Long, bulb-like structures with internal serpents, held by human figures, connected to box-like objects by braided cables. Some researchers see electric lamps, bulbs, filaments, power sources, wiring. Mainstream Egyptology interprets them as symbolic lotus flowers. The debate continues. The precision artifacts are harder to dismiss. Pre-dynastic Egyptian granite vases, carved to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, with perfectly symmetrical curves and uniform wall thickness. Modern machinists study them, wondering how they were made. Puma Punku in Bolivia displays blocks with perfectly flat surfaces, exact right angles, and interlocking joints that fit precisely despite the hardness of the stone. The drill cores from Egyptian quarries show spiral grooves, suggesting rotation speeds and cutting efficiency that shouldn't be possible with copper tools and sand. The Long Yu caves in China present another mystery. Massive underground chambers carved from solid siltstone with precision walls, decorated columns, and advanced engineering. No historical records explain who built them or why. The technical sophistication required seems anachronistic for the estimated construction period. Many out-of-place artifacts turn out to be hoaxes or misidentifications. The Koso artifact, allegedly a spark plug embedded in 500,000-year-old rock, is now lost and unverifiable. The dropper stones with their supposed alien hieroglyphics remain highly controversial. with most researchers dismissing them as fraudulent. Skepticism is warranted. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but skepticism cuts both ways. If even one of these artifacts is genuine, if even one piece of advanced technology existed thousands of years before it should, our entire timeline of human development needs revision. The alternative to ancient aliens is something more grounded. Terrestrial civilizations achieving sophistication, then collapsing, leaving scattered remnants that subsequent cultures preserved without understanding. A survivor from a collapsed technological society might retain a few tools, a few techniques, but lack the industrial infrastructure to replicate them. Those artifacts would seem impossibly advanced to the simpler cultures that inherited them. If civilization has risen and fallen repeatedly, we'd expect exactly this pattern. Occasional artifacts surviving catastrophic collapse, appearing out of time because they're remnants from previous peaks, misattributed to the cultures that preserved rather than created them. Knowledge encoded in objects that outlasted the civilizations that made them. The artifacts don't prove anything definitively, but they suggest our timeline might be less linear than we assume, our technology less unprecedented than we believe, and our place in human history less unique than we imagine. They found things that shouldn't exist for thousands of years, or things that shouldn't exist at all. But what about knowledge artifacts? Ideas that appeared too advanced too early. Around 400 BCE, Democritus proposed that all matter consists of tiny, indivisible particles he called atoms. He couldn't see them. He had no microscope, no experimental proof, no technological means to verify his theory. Yet his description of atomic theory, that matter is made of discrete units too small to perceive, moving through void, matches modern understanding remarkably well. How did he conceive something unprovable with available technology? Earlier Hindu and Buddhist texts describe reality similarly. Infinite particles in constant motion, combining and separating to form all phenomena. These weren't mystical visions but systematic philosophical frameworks describing atomic-level reality 14 centuries before Democritus, 2,000 years before scientific verification. Ancient Indian medical texts describe embryological development with surprising accuracy. Fertilization, cell division, stages of fetal growth. They lacked microscopes to observe these processes, yet their descriptions match what modern embryology confirms through advanced imaging technology. Lucretius, writing around 50 BCE, described concepts resembling evolution and natural selection 18 centuries before Darwin. He wrote about extinction, about species changing over time, about survival advantages determining which creatures persist. His work wasn't religious mythology, but naturalistic observation attempting to explain biological diversity through mechanisms we wouldn't officially discover until the 1800s. Aristarchus of Samos proposed heliocentrism around 270 BCE. Earth orbits the Sun, not the reverse, and calculated approximate distances to celestial bodies. His heliocentric model appeared 18 centuries before Copernicus, dismissed by contemporaries who couldn't imagine Earth moving, then forgotten until European astronomers rediscovered the same ideas centuries later. Consider the lost technologies. Damascus Steel's manufacturing process produced blades of legendary strength and sharpness through techniques we've only recently begun to understand, involving carbon nanotubes and specific forging temperatures. The knowledge was lost centuries ago. Roman concrete lasts millennia, while modern concrete crumbles in decades, suggesting they understood chemical processes we're still trying to replicate. Greek fire burned on water, terrifying medieval enemies. Its composition still uncertain despite modern chemistry. Ancient surgical techniques show sophistication that seems impossible without modern understanding. Trepanation, drilling into skulls, was performed thousands of years ago with high survival rates, suggesting knowledge of antiseptic practices, anesthesia, and brain anatomy. Ancient Sanskrit texts describe cataract surgery with detailed procedures. Indian physicians perform plastic surgery, skin grafts, and reconstructive procedures using techniques Western medicine wouldn't develop for centuries. The astronomical precision is perhaps most puzzling. Maya astronomers calculated Venus's cycle to within hours of modern measurements, requiring centuries of continuous observation and mathematical sophistication. Babylonians predicted eclipses hundreds of years in advance using mathematical models of celestial mechanics. Multiple cultures tracked Earth's precession, the 26,000-year axial wobble, despite that requiring observation programs spanning longer than most civilizations lasted. How do you discover what you can't observe? How do you develop concepts requiring tools you don't possess? The standard answer is gradual accumulation, lucky guesses, philosophical speculation, occasionally matching reality. But there's another possibility. What if some knowledge was inherited, not invented? What if ancient libraries preserved texts from previous civilizations, their sophistication unrecognized, their science mistaken for mythology? Each collapse destroys most knowledge, but fragments survive in books, oral traditions, symbolic form. The next civilization finds these remnants, usually misunderstands them, but occasionally someone reconstructs the truth hidden in old symbols. This explains sudden leaps, ideas appearing fully formed, knowledge without visible development. Ancient peoples weren't primitive, lucky guessers. They were inheritors of fragmentary wisdom, sometimes successfully reconstructing what their predecessors knew. They knew things they couldn't have figured out alone, unless someone had figured it out before. So if we're part of this cycle, where are we now? We built the Saturn V rocket in the 1960s. It remains the most powerful launch vehicle ever successfully operated, capable of sending humans to the moon. Between 1967 and 1973, 13 Saturn V rockets launched without a single catastrophic failure. It was, and remains, one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. Today, NASA cannot build another one. Not because we lack the technology. The problem is more fundamental. We've lost the knowledge. The engineers who designed it are mostly dead. The companies that manufactured components no longer exist. The institutional knowledge, the subtle tricks, the unwritten adjustments, the experiential wisdom that made it work, is scattered across incomplete documents that no one fully understands anymore. We have blueprints, but blueprints don't capture everything. We have manuals, but manuals assume certain baseline knowledge that's no longer common. In just 50 years, we've partially forgotten how to repeat our own greatest achievement. If we can lose something that recent, that well documented, that important, What else have we forgotten? Indigenous languages disappear at roughly 1 every 2 weeks. Each language carries unique knowledge. Medicinal plant uses developed over millennia. Agricultural techniques adapted to specific ecosystems. Oral histories extending back thousands of years. Ways of understanding and categorizing the natural world that don't exist in dominant languages. When the last speaker dies, all of it vanishes. No backup, no recovery. Traditional craftsmanship follows the same path. Master blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and woodworkers age without finding apprentices. The knowledge of working with local materials, of techniques refined through generations, of tools and methods predating industrial standardization, it dies with them. We replace it with standardized processes, assuming they're superior because they're newer. But newer isn't always better. Roman concrete lasts millennia. Ours crumbles in decades. Even our digital age isn't safe. Formats become obsolete within years. Files created in software from the 1990s are already unreadable without specialized effort. Websites vanish when companies fold or decide content isn't worth maintaining. The cloud is just someone else's servers, owned by companies that might not exist in 20 years, vulnerable to corporate decisions, technical failures, and simple neglect. Historians worry about a digital dark age. Future scholars may have better access to medieval manuscripts than to late 20th century digital records. Stone carvings last millennia. Digital files decay faster than paper, and paper decays faster than stone. We've created the most sophisticated information storage system in history, and it's also the most fragile. Farmers' generational knowledge of land and weather patterns gets replaced by satellite data and algorithmic predictions. When the systems fail, the intuitive understanding is already gone. Governments declassify old programs only to discover they've lost track of their own classified information. Files misplaced, programs forgotten, technologies developed and abandoned with knowledge scattered and incomplete. Now imagine catastrophe, electromagnetic pulse from solar flare or nuclear detonation, erasing digital storage, pandemic reducing populations, climate disaster rendering regions uninhabitable, supply chain collapse, power grid failure lasting months, then years. Without electricity, how long before our technical knowledge becomes useless? Doctors without medical equipment, engineers without computers, scientists without laboratories. They'd struggle to practice skills that require infrastructure we no longer possess. Their knowledge wouldn't disappear immediately, but it would become less applicable with each passing day. Their children would hear stories about the old world, cities with lights that never went dark, machines that flew through air, devices that let you speak to anyone anywhere. But they wouldn't understand how it worked. The technical details would fade with each retelling. Their grandchildren might remember only that ancestors had magic, that the old ones commanded lightning, that people once spoke with metal spirits. Within 3 generations, our technical civilization becomes mythology. Not metaphor, actual mythology, misunderstood and mystified because the context for understanding it no longer exists. This isn't speculation. This pattern is visible in every historical collapse. Rome fell, and Europeans forgot how to build aqueducts. The Bronze Age ended, and writing systems vanished. It happens quickly. Knowledge evaporates when the infrastructure supporting it disappears. If survivors from previous catastrophes tried desperately to preserve essential knowledge, what would they do? Carve it in stone, create oral traditions, encode it symbolically in ways that don't require literacy or technology, build monuments durable enough to outlast any collapse. Sound familiar? We're already forgetting, and we haven't even collapsed yet. But are there signs that something bigger is coming? Did the Atlanteans know before it happened? Earth's magnetic field is weakening. Over the past 2 centuries, it's declined roughly 15%. The rate of decline is accelerating. Scientists monitoring this know what it might mean. A magnetic pole reversal, where north and south flip positions. This has happened before. The geological record shows it clearly, but not during recorded human history. The last full reversal occurred 780,000 years ago. During reversal, the magnetic field weakens dramatically, potentially exposing Earth's surface to increased radiation. Navigation systems fail. Electrical grids become vulnerable to solar storms. The transition could take centuries or happen relatively quickly. We don't know because we've never experienced it. That's one risk. The list continues. Yellowstone sits atop a supervolcano, overdue by geological standards for a major eruption. The last supereruption occurred 640,000 years ago. When it goes, it won't just destroy the surrounding region. It'll affect global climate for years, potentially decades. Other supervolcanoes exist in similar, overdue status. Asteroid impacts follow statistical patterns. Small strikes happen regularly. Civilization-threatening impacts are rare but inevitable. We've started tracking near-Earth objects only recently. There's much we haven't catalogued, and some objects have orbits that could change. Ice ages cycle predictably according to Milankovitch cycles, variations in Earth's orbit, and axial tilt. We're technically still in an interglacial period, a warm phase between ice ages. These warm periods historically last 10 to 15,000 years. We're approximately 11,000 years into the current one. Modern science acknowledges these risks, but treats them as distant possibilities, problems for future millennia. But what if they're not distant? What if ancient civilizations experienced exactly these catastrophes and tried to warn us? Hopi prophecies describe previous worlds destroyed by ice, flood, and fire. Not vague apocalyptic visions, but specific environmental catastrophes matching geological events. They speak of the current world, the fourth or fifth, depending on interpretation, as approaching its own transition. Hindu texts describe yugas, vast cycles of time where ages of enlightenment decay into ages of darkness before violent renewal. The Kali Yuga, current age, is described as the final phase before destruction and rebirth. Traditional calculations place us late in this cycle. Norse Ragnarok describes world-ending catastrophe in specific detail. The sun darkening, stars disappearing, earth sinking into sea, widespread fire. Strip away the mythological framing, and it describes volcanic winter, asteroid impact, or similar environmental catastrophe remarkably clearly. Greek myths of successive ages, gold, silver, bronze, iron, each ending in destruction before the next begins, mirror the Hindu concept and suggest cultural memory of cyclical catastrophe. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 10,800 BCE, comet fragments struck Earth, triggering climate chaos, mass extinctions, continental wildfires. The evidence remains controversial, but something catastrophic definitely happened then. Some researchers suggest these impacts follow cycles related to our solar system's movement through debris streams, making them periodic rather than random. Consider the megalithic monuments from this new angle. What if they're not just knowledge repositories, but warning systems? The astronomical alignments tracking cycles, the encoded mathematics describing orbital mechanics, the symbolism depicting previous disasters. The Sphinx's possible alignment to 10,500 BCE might commemorate that date specifically as warning. This happened before, at this point in the cycle. Ancient calendars point to current times as significant. The Maya long count calendar's completion in 2012 generated widespread speculation, mostly dismissed as pseudoscience. But what if they weren't predicting apocalypse, but marking a transition point in recognizable cycles? Hindu calculations place current period as late Kali Yuga, approaching shift. Various indigenous prophecies describe present times as critical juncture. Modern science and ancient prophecy might be describing the same patterns through different languages. Geological cycles, astronomical mechanics, climate shifts. These are real, measurable, periodic. Ancient survivors who'd experienced previous catastrophes would recognize the patterns, would build systems to track them, would try desperately to warn future generations. The monuments encode warnings we're only beginning to decode. The myths preserve memories we dismissed as fantasy. The calendars mark cycles we're just starting to recognize scientifically. Earth periodically resets. Life adapts or dies. Civilizations rise and fall. The pattern is real, documented in rock layers and ice cores, remembered in stories and carved in stone. They tried to warn us. We called their warnings mythology, but if they knew this was coming, did they prepare? And should we? After catastrophe, what survives? Not the delicate, not the complex, not the dependent. What survives is durable, simple, independent. The survivors understood this. Their preparation strategies reflect hard-won wisdom about preservation. Stone lasts, paper burns, digital files corrupt. Oral traditions persist if practiced. This hierarchy of durability shaped their choices. The megalithic monuments aren't primitive attempts at construction. They're humanity's most durable storage medium. No electricity required. No maintenance needed. No translation software to become obsolete. Just information encoded in geometry and proportion, waiting for future civilizations advanced enough to decode it. The placement reveals strategic thinking. Knowledge sites sit near reliable water sources. They're in geologically stable regions, unlikely to experience earthquakes or volcanic activity. They're at elevations safe from flooding and sea level rise. They have natural defenses, deserts, mountains, geography that protects them through climate shifts and human conflicts. These weren't random locations. These were carefully calculated refuges, chosen to remain accessible across millennia. Distributed redundancy appears globally. The same mathematical constants encoded at Giza, Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan, and other sites. Not coincidence, but deliberate backup. If several sites are destroyed, others preserve the information. If one culture forgets, another might remember. This explains the global similarities. Not alien intervention, but intentional redundancy by people who understood how easily knowledge disappears. Symbolic encoding transcends language. Pi is pi, regardless of what you call it. The golden ratio functions identically, whether expressed in Greek, Sanskrit, or Mayan glyphs. Astronomical alignments communicate to anyone who can observe the sky. Geometric principles work the same in every culture. By encoding knowledge symbolically rather than linguistically, they made it accessible to any future civilization that developed mathematical sophistication, regardless of language barriers. Mystery schools preserved knowledge through methods that survive literacy loss. Oral transmission, memorization, ritual practice. These seem primitive, but they're remarkably effective. Knowledge transmitted person to person, teacher to student, master to initiate. No books to burn, no databases to corrupt, just human memory and human teaching. The oldest and most resilient information technology we possess. Myths encode practical survival knowledge. Flood stories contain instructions about reading warning signs and preparation techniques. Agricultural myths preserve seasonal cycles and planting knowledge. Creation stories embed astronomical observations useful for navigation and timekeeping. What we dismiss as primitive superstition often contains compressed practical information, survival wisdom wrapped in memorable narrative. Modern civilization can learn from these strategies. Decentralized knowledge storage. Digital clouds are vulnerable single points of failure. Preserve information in multiple formats, not just latest technology. Maintain hands-on practical skills. Traditional agriculture, craftsmanship, basic medicine. Skills that function without industrial infrastructure. The seed vaults preserving genetic diversity. Parallel ancient redundancy thinking. Technical knowledge bases being printed and stored in multiple locations worldwide. Eco-distributed preservation. Craftspeople teaching traditional techniques ensure skills don't die with individuals. The prepper instinct, often mocked, might be inherited wisdom from ancestors who survived collapses by valuing self-sufficiency and preparedness. If Atlantean survivors preserved knowledge across catastrophe, their methods worked. We're reading their messages now, decoding their warnings, learning from monuments they built, knowing they wouldn't live to see them appreciated. The knowledge survived because they understood how to encode it durably, how to distribute it redundantly, how to transmit it effectively. That's the ultimate lesson. Knowledge preservation isn't about having the most advanced storage technology. It's about understanding fragility, planning for worst cases, encoding information in ways that outlast infrastructure collapse. They left us the manual. We just forgot how to read it. But there's one more pattern we need to understand. One more thing they tried to teach us. The separation is modern. For most of human history, the astronomer was a priest. The physician performed rituals. The mathematician contemplated the divine. This wasn't confusion. This was integration, understanding reality as simultaneously mechanical and meaningful, physical and philosophical, knowable and mysterious. Egyptian temples weren't just places of worship. They were universities. The priests who performed ceremonies also calculated the Nile's flood cycles, designed architectural alignments, practiced medicine, and taught geometry. These weren't separate roles. Knowledge was holistic. Studying the stars meant understanding both their predictable movements and their significance to human existence. Healing the body involved both physical treatments and psychological support. Building structures required both engineering precision and aesthetic meaning. Pythagoras taught mathematics as spiritual revelation. Numbers weren't just quantities, but cosmic principles. The relationships between numbers revealed universal truths. His school combined rigorous mathematical study with meditation, dietary restrictions, and ethical training. To understand mathematics, students first had to develop consciousness capable of perceiving deeper patterns. Vedic traditions integrated geometry, astronomy, and meditation seamlessly. The same texts containing astronomical observations included breathing techniques. The scholars who calculated planetary movements also explored consciousness states. They saw no contradiction. Outer cosmos and inner experience reflected each other. As above, so below. As without, so within. Chinese Taoist alchemists pursued immortality while developing practical chemistry. Their experiments with minerals and compounds, their careful observations of reactions and transformations, advanced material science while they sought spiritual transcendence. The two goals weren't opposed. Understanding matter's transformation informed understanding consciousness transformation. Islamic scholars in medieval Baghdad's House of Wisdom studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy together. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra while contemplating theological questions. Ibn Sina wrote about medicine and metaphysics in the same breath. Knowledge was unified. Fragmenting it would have seemed bizarre, even dangerous. This integration made sense. If you track celestial movements for decades, you develop both predictive equations and existential wonder about humanity's place in cosmic vastness. If you study human health, you observe both physical mechanisms and questions about consciousness, will, and healing beyond pure biology. If you build monuments, you work with both structural engineering and the meanings those structures communicate. Atlantean survivors, if they existed, would likely have preserved knowledge this way. They'd witnessed catastrophe. They understood civilization's fragility. They wouldn't have separated technical from philosophical teachings because both were essential. Technical knowledge alone had failed their civilization. Sophistication without wisdom led to destruction. So they'd preserve both. How things work and how to think about using that knowledge wisely. Mystery schools make sense through this lens. Initiation wasn't about learning secrets for power. It was about developing complete human beings. Students learned mathematics and meditation together. They studied astronomy while contemplating existence. They practiced architecture alongside ethics. The technical education came packaged with psychological development, ensuring knowledge users possess the wisdom to wield it properly. If you only teach what without teaching how to use it wisely, knowledge becomes dangerous. Ancient survivors understood this from experience. So they built educational systems, cultivating judgment alongside capability, ethics alongside technique, wisdom alongside knowledge. The apparent mysticism wasn't superstition. It was deliberate integration of inner and outer development. The rituals trained consciousness. The symbols encoded multiple meaning layers. The initiatory experiences transformed psychology while transmitting information. Students emerged not just informed but wise, not just capable but ethical. Over time, civilizations fragmented. Some groups preserved technical knowledge, craftsmen, engineers, architects. Others maintained philosophical traditions, monks, priests, contemplatives. Few kept the synthesis. We inherited the fragments, but forgot they were parts of integrated whole. Modern science and spirituality stand separate, often opposed. But that separation is historical accident, not necessity. Ancient wisdom suggests different possibility. Knowledge systems integrating empirical observation with philosophical reflection, technical capability with ethical judgment, outer exploration with inner development. They didn't separate knowing from being, because they'd learned that knowledge without wisdom destroys everything. But what specifically did they understand about consciousness and reality? Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient practitioners knew empirically. Meditation physically changes the brain. Vedic dhyana, Buddhist vipassana, Taoist inner alchemy. These practices weren't mystical fantasies, but systematic technologies for consciousness development. Brain scans show increased grey matter density, altered neural connectivity, enhanced emotional regulation, improved cognitive function. The ancients couldn't see neurons firing, but they observed outcomes carefully, refined techniques through centuries of experimentation, and preserved methods that produced reliable results. Ancient psychological understanding was sophisticated. Hindu texts categorize consciousness states with precision matching modern phenomenology. Buddhist psychology maps relationships between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways cognitive science now validates. Greek and Roman masters of rhetoric understood persuasion principles that modern psychology rediscovered as cognitive biases and social influence mechanisms. Egyptian priests practiced dream incubation, systematically working with unconscious processes through controlled dreaming techniques. Memory training reveals how much cognitive potential we've forgotten. Oral cultures transmitted vast knowledge without writing. Aboriginal Australian songlines encode thousands of miles of geographical information in narrative form, perfectly preserved across generations. Polynesian navigators memorized star paths through story and chant, maintaining precision navigation knowledge without charts. Greek memory palaces allowed orators to recall hours of speech perfectly. These weren't supernatural abilities, but trained skills, systematic methods anyone can learn through disciplined practice. Breathing techniques appear universally because they work. Pranayama in yoga, Tibetan Tummo, Taoist Qigong, shamanic breathwork, all produce measurable physiological changes. Modern research confirms they affect neurotransmitter balance, hormone levels, oxygen utilization, autonomic nervous system function. Fast breathing creates alkalosis, altering consciousness. Slow breathing activates parasympathetic response, inducing calm. Specific patterns generate specific states. The ancients discovered these relationships through systematic experimentation, encoded them in teachable practices, and transmitted them across millennia. Collective practices tap real neurological phenomena. Group meditation creates synchronization observable in brain activity. Synchronized ritual activates mirror neuron systems, generating shared emotional experiences. Chanting and rhythm entrain neural oscillations across participants. These aren't mystical connections, but biological mechanisms enabling group psychological states. Ancient cultures understood this practically, using collective practices to strengthen social bonds, transmit cultural values, and create shared transformative experiences. If Atlantean survivors were preserving civilization across catastrophe, inner technologies would be as crucial as external ones. Mental resilience to endure trauma, emotional stability to make clear decisions under pressure, cognitive flexibility to adapt when circumstances change, wisdom to use powerful knowledge responsibly. These psychological capacities might matter more than technical knowledge, because without them, technical knowledge destroys rather than builds. Mystery schools might have deliberately cultivated complete human beings, not just teaching what to know, but developing how to think, not just transmitting information, but transforming psychology. Initiates learned mathematics while practicing meditation. They studied astronomy while developing ethical frameworks. They gained architectural knowledge alongside psychological insight. The education integrated outer and inner, creating not just knowledgeable specialists, but wise humans capable of making good decisions with powerful capabilities. Modern psychology rediscovers these insights constantly. Mindfulness enters mainstream therapy because it works. Breathwork treats trauma because it accesses nervous system regulation. Psychedelic research confirms therapeutic value of altered state. Indigenous traditions have used for millennia. Neuroscience validates meditation benefits ancient practitioners claimed. We're not inventing new psychological technologies. We're recovering old ones, rediscovering what was systematically developed, tested, and refined over thousands of years before being dismissed as primitive superstition. Much of what we called mysticism was practical psychology. Methods for working with consciousness, techniques for developing human potential, systematic approaches to cultivating wisdom alongside knowledge. If this understanding was preserved from Atlantean times through mystery school lineages, it represents sophisticated psychological technology we're only beginning to reappreciate. The ancients mastered something we're still learning. They developed technologies for the hardware we're running on. External tools change. Internal architecture remains constant. They understood consciousness from inside, through direct experimentation with their own awareness, developing methods that work because they're based on how human psychology actually functions. They mastered the technology we're still inside of, consciousness itself. But what about the deepest questions? About time, existence, the nature of reality itself? What did they understand? Time moves in a line, we're taught. Past behind us, future ahead. The present, a moving point, progressing from beginning toward end. This linear conception dominates Western thinking, but it's not universal. Most ancient traditions saw time differently. Not line, but wheel. Not progress, but cycle. Not beginning and end, but eternal return. Hindu cosmology describes yugas, vast ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years, cycling from golden age through progressively darker periods before dissolution and renewal. The Maya long count tracked cycles within cycles, time periods nested like wheels within wheels. Egyptian philosophy emphasized eternal return, daily rebirth of the sun symbolizing cosmic patterns of death and renewal. These weren't primitive myths, but sophisticated frameworks for understanding time's nature. Modern physics echoes these ancient ideas unexpectedly. Cyclical universe models, where big bangs and big crunches repeat eternally. Block universe concepts where past, present, and future exist simultaneously. Time's flow, an illusion of consciousness. Quantum mechanics' strange relationship with time, where cause and effect become ambiguous at fundamental scales. Ancient philosophers were exploring symbolically what modern physicists describe mathematically. The concept of eternal return appears across traditions. Hindu and Buddhist cycles of existence. Greek Stoic philosophy. Later Western thought through Nietzsche. The idea that all events repeat infinitely, that we've lived these moments before and will again, that history is circular rather than linear. Disturbing to modern sensibility, but it might describe reality more accurately than linear time. If universe cycles eternally, we do too. As above, so below. The ancient principle of correspondence. Patterns repeat at all scales, cosmic to atomic. Modern fractal mathematics confirms this mathematically. The same patterns appearing whether you zoom in or out, scale invariance throughout nature. The ancients observed this phenomenologically, built it into philosophy and architecture, understood that reality mirrors itself recursively across scales. Ancient traditions framed destruction and renewal not as tragedy, but as necessary process. Hindu dissolution and recreation. Egyptian daily death and rebirth of the sun. Greek cycles of ages. Buddhist understanding of impermanence and transformation. Everything ends. Everything begins again. This is the pattern, not anomaly, but fundamental rhythm of existence. For survivors of catastrophe, this philosophy offers psychological framework for coping with loss. Rather than despair that everything was destroyed, they could frame it as inevitable cycle. This age ended. The next begins. Knowledge must be preserved through transition. The philosophy makes them effective at preservation because they're not trying to prevent the inevitable, but preparing for it, working with the cycle rather than against it. This perspective manifests in monument building, creating for eternity because the cycle demands it, encoding knowledge for future iterations, understanding you might not be there to explain it, accepting your culture might not survive, but the knowledge can, if properly preserved. This deep time thinking, measuring in millennia, seeing current events as moments in vast cycles, might be ancient wisdom's most important offering. Modern civilization thinks in election cycles and quarterly profits. We're approaching possible catastrophes while focusing on immediate concerns, unable to plan beyond our lifetimes, barely thinking past our quarterly earnings reports. The ancient cyclical perspective offers different framework, thinking in civilizational timescales, making decisions accounting for long-term patterns, preparing for transitions that might not happen in our lifetimes but will eventually come. If Atlantean philosophy survived fragmented through various traditions, its core message might be, catastrophes will come, civilizations will fall. But if we prepare, knowledge and humanity persist through any cycle. Not fatalism, but active wisdom. Not despair, but practical preparation for inevitable patterns. They saw time as a wheel and understood that what falls can rise again if wisdom survives the descent. So if they built all this, the monuments, the knowledge, the warnings, what do we do with it? In 2017, scientists used cosmic ray muon detection to scan the Great Pyramid. The technology reveals hidden structures by measuring how subatomic particles pass through stone. They found a void, a massive chamber, previously unknown, sitting above the Grand Gallery. The pyramid, explored for centuries, photographed endlessly, studied by generations of archaeologists, was still hiding secrets. This keeps happening. New technology reveals what was always there, but invisible to previous generations. Satellite imaging discovers megalithic structures buried under jungle canopy. Ground-penetrating radar maps underground chambers beneath temples. Acoustic analysis shows that ancient halls were designed for specific resonance frequencies, turning buildings into instruments tuned to particular tones. Computer modeling identifies astronomical alignments so precise they couldn't have been accidental. The monuments are more sophisticated than we understood. They're still revealing themselves. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical constants. The ratio of perimeter to height is exactly 2 pi. The base perimeter relates to Earth's circumference at the same scale as the pyramid's height relates to Earth's radius. The structure is a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere, built with precision we struggle to match. Some researchers claim it encodes the speed of light, distances to celestial bodies, even fundamental constants of physics. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical of extreme claims, but the mathematical relationships are undeniable. Something sophisticated was encoded there. Göbekli Tepe's pillars might depict astronomical events. Carvings analyzed by researchers suggest representation of comet impact around 10,900 BCE, matching the Younger Dryas event, exactly when Plato said Atlantis was destroyed. The pillars might be humanity's oldest disaster record, carved warnings about what happened when the sky fell. Angkor Wat's layout mirrors the constellation, Draco as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. Not as it looked when the temple was built in the 1100 CE, but as it appeared 7,000 years earlier. The builders either possessed ancient astronomical records or were deliberately commemorating that specific date. Either way, it suggests connection to knowledge predating their culture. Mayan inscriptions contain zero as mathematical concept, place value systems, calculations of vast time periods. European mathematics wouldn't develop these tools for centuries after the Maya. The sophistication appears too early, as if inherited from older sources rather than independently developed. Decoding requires multiple disciplines: archaeologists, astronomers, mathematicians, linguists, acousticians, geologists, all contributing pieces. The monuments contain layered information, basic features obvious to any observer. deeper mathematical relationships requiring literacy in geometry, even deeper alignments discoverable only through computer analysis of star positions across millennia, like encryption with progressive complexity, revealing more as the observer's sophistication increases. Some claims venture into controversy. Researchers argue pyramids functioned as power generators, that global sites form energy grids, that monuments create measurable electromagnetic anomalies. Mainstream science dismisses most such theories, but some anomalies are measurable: unusual magnetic fields, acoustic properties, electromagnetic readings that don't have obvious explanations. These deserve investigation, even if specific interpretations remain speculative. Each generation brings new tools. Ground-penetrating radar reveals what's buried. Satellite imaging discovers what's hidden. Computer modeling reconstructs what changed. The sites release information progressively, as if designed to reveal themselves gradually as humanity develops capacity to understand. Brilliant preservation strategy, encoding knowledge that becomes accessible when recipients achieve sufficient sophistication. If Atlantean survivors designed these monuments, they thought across vast timescales, encoding messages for civilizations thousands of years future, trusting that intelligence would eventually reconstruct their meaning, betting that someone would someday possess the tools and knowledge to decode what they left behind. We're that someone right now, advanced enough to read the messages, but possibly approaching another catastrophic period where that knowledge becomes urgently necessary. The timing isn't coincidental. The warnings become readable exactly when we might need them most. The monuments are still talking. We're finally learning their language. But understanding isn't enough. What should we do with this knowledge? Two. Terrace agriculture appears across ancient cultures independently. Peru, Philippines, China, Mediterranean. Civilizations that never contacted each other built the same solution. Carved hillsides into stepped platforms that prevent erosion, capture water, create microclimates, and maintain soil fertility indefinitely. Modern industrial agriculture depletes topsoil in decades. Ancient terraces have produced crops for thousands of years without degradation. We're rediscovering this now as industrial methods fail. Sustainable agriculture movements adopt terracing, crop rotation, polyculture, techniques ancient farmers used as standard practice, not because they were primitive, but because these methods work long-term. They require more knowledge and less machinery, more understanding and less chemistry, more patience and less force. Roman aqueducts still function after 2,000 years. Persian qanats move water without pumps through underground channels designed to prevent evaporation. These systems require no electricity, minimal maintenance, and outlast modern infrastructure, built with advanced materials and sophisticated engineering. As energy becomes expensive and climate unpredictable, ancient water management offers proven alternatives. Ancient construction used local materials intelligently, buildings designed for specific climates, thick walls providing thermal mass in deserts, elevated structures allowing airflow in humid tropics, compact designs minimizing heat loss in cold regions, passive climate control requiring no energy input. Modern buildings depend on constant artificial heating and cooling because we've forgotten how to build for place. As energy costs rise, Ancient architectural wisdom becomes economically attractive, not just romantically appealing. Knowledge transmission through apprenticeship ensures practical skills survive. Master teaches student through hands-on practice, embodied learning that doesn't depend on documentation. When books burn or databases corrupt, craft knowledge persists if transmitted, person to person. Modern education emphasizes abstract information over practical skill, creating vulnerability when systems fail. Ancient methods offer resilience. Indigenous governance systems prevented power concentration through distributed decision-making, consensus building, and collective responsibility. Many cultures maintained social cohesion without centralized authority, ensured resource distribution without markets, resolved conflicts through restoration rather than punishment. As modern institutions fail to address inequality and polarization, ancient social technologies deserve examination. Resilience came from diversification. Ancient communities maintained multiple food sources rather than monocultures, decentralized production rather than global supply chains, local sufficiency rather than complete interdependence. When disruption hit, systems degraded gracefully rather than collapsing completely. Modern efficiency creates fragility. Ancient redundancy created resilience. Current vulnerabilities suggest we overvalued efficiency and undervalued redundancy. Mental health challenges, anxiety, depression, isolation, might respond to ancient practices. Ritual providing structure, community offering belonging, nature connection, grounding consciousness, meaningful work creating purpose. Modern life optimizes for economic productivity while neglecting psychological needs. Ancient societies addressed through daily practice. The meditation, ceremony, and community integration once standard are now luxuries or dismissed as primitive. But they addressed human needs our civilization overlooks. This isn't advocating return to primitive conditions. It's suggesting intelligent integration, using ancient wisdom to inform modern technology, creating synthesis stronger than either alone. Atlantean survivors might have done exactly this, integrating their advanced knowledge with local wisdom, adopting what worked, contributing what they knew, creating hybrid systems. Modern initiatives already rediscover this. Biomimicry uses nature's designs for engineering solutions. Traditional ecological knowledge informs conservation and climate adaptation. Indigenous resource management gets adopted by environmental managers, recognizing its effectiveness. Ancient philosophy informs modern therapy. The practical value becomes obvious when ideology stops blocking examination. The survivor's most important gift might not be high technology we fixate on, but sustainable approaches, allowing civilizations to persist for millennia. They understood limits. They worked within cycles. They valued wisdom alongside capability. If we're approaching resource crises and potential catastrophes, their knowledge about living sustainably becomes survival information, not historical curiosity. They solved problems we're just creating because they'd seen where our path leads. But to implement these solutions, we need to fundamentally change how we think about knowledge itself. What mental shift do we need? Political leaders think in election cycles, 2 to 4 years. Businesses think in quarterly earnings, 3 months. Media thinks in news cycles, hours, maybe days. We've trained ourselves for short-term thinking, optimized institutions for immediate results, lost capacity to consider long time frames. This makes us terrible at addressing slow-moving problems. Climate change unfolds over decades. Resource depletion spans generations. Systemic risks accumulate gradually. We can't see them clearly because our cognitive frameworks don't extend far enough forward. We're thinking in minutes while problems operate in centuries. Ancient civilizations thought differently. Egyptian dynasties planned across thousands of years. Hindu cosmology described cycles spanning millions. Indigenous cultures made decisions considering 7 generations ahead. Roughly 200 years. Medieval cathedral builders worked on structures they'd never see completed, sometimes spanning centuries to construction, built for futures beyond their lifetimes. This wasn't impractical idealism. This was cultivated cognitive habit, deliberate cultural value. They chose to think long-term. Oral traditions preserving 10,000-year histories made deep past feel present. Astronomical observations tracking millennia-long cycles created awareness of vast timescales. Spiritual frameworks emphasizing reincarnation or ancestral continuity encourage thinking beyond single lifetimes. Community identity, rather than individual identity, made people care about group survival across generations. Atlantean survivors would naturally think this way. Having watched their civilization drown, they'd encode knowledge for civilizations thousands of years future. They'd build monuments meant to last tens of thousands of years. They'd plan knowledge preservation across multiple potential catastrophes. This requires cognitive frameworks most modern people lack. We can cultivate them. Study astronomy until Earth's 4 billion year age becomes emotionally real, not just abstract fact. Practice genealogical thinking. Trace your lineage backward. Project it forward. Understand yourself as temporary link in chain stretching both directions beyond your comprehension. Engage with long-duration projects. Plant trees you won't see mature. Start traditions you won't see completed. Contribute to work spanning beyond your lifetime. Consider decisions' implications for distant future regularly, not occasionally, as philosophical exercise, but habitually. What does this choice mean in 50 years? 200? 1,000? This practice rewires temporal awareness gradually. Indigenous practices maintain deep time naturally. Australian Aboriginal songlines preserve knowledge across 10,000 years through oral tradition. Polynesian navigation wisdom transmits accurately across hundreds of generations. Many indigenous decision-making protocols explicitly consider effects on future generations. Place-based knowledge passes down through millennia, maintaining detailed environmental understanding. Current science is only beginning to appreciate. These aren't mystical abilities. These are cultivated cognitive habits, teachable skills, practical frameworks anyone can develop through intentional practice. Recovering deep time thinking might be essential for survival. Our biggest challenges: climate change, resource depletion, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, require thinking across centuries or millennia to address properly. But our institutions are locked in quarterly thinking. Ancient civilizations' ability to think in deep time let them survive longer than modern civilization has existed yet. If we're to avoid catastrophe and preserve knowledge across turbulent futures, we need this cognitive capacity, not as luxury, but as necessity. This might be the ultimate gift survivors tried to leave. Not just technical knowledge, but mental framework for using knowledge wisely. thinking in vast cycles, preparing for long futures, making decisions accounting for deep time rather than immediate convenience. Learning to think like they did might be prerequisite for understanding what they left behind. They thought in millennia, while we think in minutes. That might be what destroys us or saves us. So if we accept all this, the evidence, the patterns, the warnings, what does it all mean? Where does it lead? Start with anomalies. Advanced knowledge appearing too early. The Sumerians with their sophisticated mathematics, the Egyptians with their astronomical precision, Göbekli Tepe predating agriculture, myths scattered across continents describing teachers from the sea, megalithic sites built with impossible accuracy. None of it made sense individually. Then Plato's account. Not vague mythology, but specific details. 9600 BCE, an island beyond Gibraltar. Concentric rings of water and land. Violent earthquakes and floods destroying it in a day and night. That date, 9600 BCE, matches exactly when the Younger Dryas ended, when Ice Age conditions collapsed catastrophically, when sea levels rose 400 feet, drowning coastlines worldwide. Egypt emerged fully formed around 3100 BCE with writing, architecture, astronomy already sophisticated. No learning curve. They spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods taught humans, dated to 10,000 years before their era. The Shemsu Hor, followers of divine teachers, preserving ancient knowledge through dark ages. The Sphinx, possibly carved during wetter climate period around 10,000 BCE, showing water erosion impossible in Egypt's arid millennia. Sumer appeared with no clear precursor, carrying advanced mathematics, astronomical knowledge requiring centuries of observation, and explicit traditions of the Ap-Kalu, wise beings emerging from the sea who taught civilization systematically, their language unrelated to any other, suggesting foreign origin. The Persian Gulf Basin, now water, was fertile valley during Ice Age, exactly what Sumerian texts describe before the flood drowned it. The Americas preserved legends of bearded teachers arriving from eastern seas after great floods. Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, different names, same story. They taught agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, then departed across the water. The advanced knowledge appearing in American civilizations matches these teaching myths. Maya astronomy more accurate than European calendars. Stone-cutting precision we struggle to replicate. Agricultural innovations supporting massive populations. The global network becomes visible. Megalithic sites separated by thousands of miles, encoding identical mathematical constants. Giza, Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan, all precisely aligned astronomically, all containing pi and phi in their dimensions, all positioned at mathematically significant distances from each other. Not coincidence, deliberate coordination. A preservation network ensuring knowledge survived even if individual sites were destroyed. Maritime evidence scattered everywhere once you look. Cocaine in Egyptian mummies. The Peary race map showing Antarctica's coast. Viking settlements proving Atlantic crossings long before Columbus. Phoenician circumnavigation of Africa. Ocean currents and wind patterns making regular transoceanic contact feasible for competent sailors. The ocean wasn't barrier, it was highway. The philosophical pattern completes the picture. Cyclical time concepts universal across disconnected cultures. Integration of science and spirituality in ancient education. Inner technologies for consciousness development. Mystery schools preserving not just technical knowledge, but wisdom frameworks, all suggesting sophisticated civilization that understood both external reality and internal experience, that valued judgment alongside capability, that recognized knowledge without wisdom destroys. Evidence of previous collapses everywhere. The Bronze Age collapse. Rome's fall. Baghdad battery. Saqqara bird. Anachronistic knowledge appearing too early. Precision artifacts predating supposed capability. Ideas like atomic theory, heliocentrism, evolution described thousands of years before official discovery. Each piece can be disputed individually. Alternative explanations exist for specific anomalies. But patterns are more robust than individual data points. When dozens of separate mysteries all fit the same framework, when myths and archaeology and geology and ancient texts all point toward the same narrative, when the hypothesis explains so much, so consistently, it demands consideration. This isn't definitive proof. It's coherent pattern. A framework making sense of multiple anomalies simultaneously. The evidence suggests advanced maritime civilization around 9600 BCE, destroyed by catastrophic climate change. Survivors scattering globally and systematically teaching local populations, preserving their knowledge through monuments, myths, and mystery schools, creating the foundations for what we call ancient civilizations. The documentary has laid out the pieces. Survivor diaspora, knowledge preservation in stone and symbol, cyclical catastrophes recorded in geology and remembered in myth, warning systems encoded in monuments, deep time wisdom about thinking across vast scales. The interconnections become visible when you step back far enough to see the whole pattern. Individually, they're curiosities. Together, they're a map showing exactly where we came from. But if this is true, if they built what we call history, what does that mean for us? If Atlantean survivors seeded known civilizations, recorded history is just the most recent chapter. Everything we call ancient, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, would be relatively modern, visible culmination of thousands of years of invisible preparation. Human civilization becomes much older, much more sophisticated, and much more fragile than we imagined. The implications cascade. Cultural development wasn't independent invention. It was inheritance. Most major civilizations weren't starting from zero, but building on transmitted knowledge, learning from teachers carrying fragments of older wisdom. The similarities we see: astronomical knowledge, mathematical constants, architectural principles, aren't coincidental convergence, but shared source material. Human history isn't linear progress from primitive to advanced. It's cyclical. Rise and fall, rise and fall. Each iteration thinking itself first, unaware of predecessors who walked the same path. Our technological civilization isn't unprecedented. It might be one peak among many in cycles stretching back impossibly far. Archaeological implications follow. Vast potential evidence lies underwater on drowned coastlines. Conventional dating methods might miss earlier civilizations entirely. Resistance to alternative theories might cause science to overlook genuine evidence. Indigenous oral traditions, dismissed as myth, might be historically accurate memory spanning thousands of years. Psychological weight comes next. If Atlantis was real and destroyed, catastrophic collapse isn't theoretical possibility. It's happened to advanced civilizations before. This should radically affect how we assess existential risks. If survivors preserved crucial knowledge across catastrophe, then knowledge preservation isn't academic concern. It's civilization's most important function, the difference between survival and permanent loss. If they encoded warnings in monuments and myths, we should be paying attention instead of dismissing them as primitive superstition. Philosophical implications deepen understanding. If human consciousness developed sophisticated inner technologies thousands of years ago, our species' potential exceeds modern culture's recognition. If ancient wisdom traditions maintain knowledge our civilization lost, then primitive and advanced need rethinking. Sophistication comes in forms beyond technology, in sustainable practices, in psychological understanding, in wisdom about using power well. If cyclical time concepts reflect actual patterns rather than mythological fancy, Eastern philosophies might be more empirically grounded than Western linear thinking acknowledges. The wheel of time might describe reality more accurately than the arrow. Spiritual implications require careful consideration. This doesn't validate specific religious claims, but it suggests myths and sacred traditions contain more historical truth than secular society acknowledges. Spiritual traditions deserve respect, not just as faith, but as potential historical memory. The ancient integration of spirituality and knowledge might have been correct. Wisdom about using knowledge well matters as much as knowledge itself. For modern civilization, the implications become urgent. If we're late in a cycle, approaching transition, then current global instability fits predicted patterns. Multiple risks converging. Systems showing strain. Knowledge being lost faster than preserved. If ancient warnings are coming due, preparing for catastrophic possibilities becomes rational rather than paranoid. If knowledge preservation was survivors' priority after catastrophe, it should be ours before one. If they rebuilt civilization across thousands of years of struggle, recovery is possible even after worse disasters, but only if knowledge survives the collapse. Perhaps the most important implication is humility. We're not the first, might not be the last. Part of much longer human story than we imagined. Our technical achievements are impressive, but might be rediscoveries rather than first discoveries. The mathematics we invented might be mathematics we remembered. The wisdom we're developing might be wisdom we're recovering. Our civilization's continuity depends on the same factors that determined previous civilizations' fates. Wisdom alongside knowledge. Preparation alongside innovation. Long-term thinking alongside immediate capability. Resilience alongside efficiency. We're still students of those ancient teachers, still learning from knowledge they managed to preserve across immense time, still trying to decode messages they left in stone and symbol and story. Recognizing this doesn't diminish modern achievements. It contextualizes them. We're benefiting from inheritance we didn't fully acknowledge. building on foundations we didn't recognize, following patterns we thought were new, but are actually ancient. Understanding this might help us avoid repeating the mistakes that destroyed previous civilizations. Not because we're smarter or better, but because we can see the pattern. We have the map. We know the cycle. The question is whether we have the wisdom to use that knowledge. If they were real, then everything we thought we invented, we actually remembered. But there's one more question. The most important one. What happens next? The warnings converge from multiple directions. Climatologists describe tipping points approaching faster than models predicted. Geologists note Yellowstone and other supervolcanoes overdue by geological standards. Astronomers track near-Earth asteroids, catalogue potential impacts, acknowledge how much remains uncatalogued. Ecologists document the sixth mass extinction already underway. Social scientists observe increasing instability, polarization, systems under unprecedented stress. Each field sees trouble in its domain. Together, they sketch multiple catastrophic scenarios, any one of which could dramatically alter civilization's trajectory. Are risks genuinely increasing, or are we just more aware? Both, probably. Population density means any disaster affects billions. Global interconnection means regional collapse cascades worldwide. Resource depletion and climate change create vulnerabilities previous civilizations never faced. Nuclear weapons and bioengineering give us self-destruction capabilities no previous society possessed. We face unprecedented risks from our own technological power. But previous civilizations probably felt similarly at their ends. Atlanteans likely didn't see catastrophe coming. Romans in 400 CE didn't expect their empire's imminent collapse. Bronze Age peoples were blindsided by the collapse that erased their world. The question isn't whether catastrophe is possible. It obviously is. The question is whether we're prepared. Signs suggest growing awareness, surge in interest in resilience, sustainability, preparedness, space programs explicitly pursuing multi-planetary humanity, seed vaults preserving genetic diversity, knowledge repositories being established in multiple formats and locations, movements toward decentralization, local sufficiency, traditional skills, resurging interest in ancient wisdom, indigenous knowledge, alternative ways of living. These parallel what Atlantean survivors did, recognizing catastrophe as real possibility, taking concrete steps to preserve knowledge and capability, preparing not from paranoia, but from pattern recognition. The time frame remains uncertain. Ancient warnings point to current era, but aren't precise. Scientific warnings suggest critical period over next 50 to 200 years, depending on which risk dominates. Honest answer is we don't know exact timing, just as Atlanteans probably couldn't predict their catastrophe's precise moment. But patterns suggest concerning convergence, multiple risk factors aligning, systems showing strain, historical parallels becoming visible, two futures branch from here. One where we ignore warnings, continue unsustainable practices, experience catastrophic collapse similar to Atlantis. Survivors scramble to preserve whatever knowledge survives, hoping future civilizations decode what they manage to save. The cycle continues. Another, where we learn from ancient patterns. Take warnings seriously. Develop genuine resilience and sustainability. Navigate challenges without collapse. Become the first civilization to consciously break the cycle, to recognize the pattern and choose differently. We have advantages Atlanteans didn't. We know the pattern. We've decoded warnings. We have their knowledge as guide. We could choose differently. But this requires overcoming short-term thinking, political division, institutional inertia. Exactly what prevented previous societies from adapting when they had the chance. Whether catastrophe comes or not, ancient knowledge has value. It teaches resilience, sustainability, wisdom, deep time thinking, knowledge preservation methods. Whether we're preparing for collapse or just building better civilization, survivors' lessons remain relevant. They showed that civilization can persist through catastrophic change if knowledge is preserved and wisdom maintained. That might be their ultimate gift. Not predicting when next collapse comes, but showing us how to survive it when it does, and maybe, just maybe, how to prevent it if we're wise enough. The cycle turns whether we're ready or not, but for the first time in the pattern's long history, a civilization can see it coming. We have the map. We understand the cycle. We've decoded the warnings left in stone and myth. The cycle turns whether we're ready or not. But for the first time, we can see it coming. So the question becomes personal. What will you do with this knowledge? The Atlantean survivors weren't superhuman. They weren't chosen by gods or blessed with special powers. They were people who watched their world drown and made a choice. Knowledge matters enough to fight for, to preserve, to transmit across whatever comes next. That choice defined them. That choice created the legacy we've been exploring. Anyone can make that choice. Being a knowledge keeper doesn't require credentials or special training. It's conscious decision to value knowledge, to take responsibility for its preservation, to pass it forward. It starts with recognizing that everything we know is fragile, that skills and wisdom can vanish within a generation if no one teaches them, that forgetting is the default state unless we actively resist it. Start practical. Learn skills that don't require infrastructure. Gardening, understanding how food actually grows, how soil works, what plants need. Cooking from scratch without relying on processed ingredients or electric appliances. Basic medicine, recognizing common ailments, knowing which plants help healing, understanding when to worry and when to wait. Traditional crafts, working with your hands, understanding materials, creating functional objects. Repair and maintenance, fixing things instead of replacing them. Understanding how tools work, developing mechanical intuition. These aren't prepper extremes. These are fundamental human capabilities our ancestors possessed as baseline competence. Modern convenience made us forget them. If infrastructure fails, these skills become immediately valuable. Even without collapse, they're empowering. Knowing you can feed yourself, heal minor injuries, make necessary items, maintain your tools creates confidence and independence. Preserve cultural knowledge before it vanishes. Document family histories. Sit with elders and record their stories, their memories, their understanding of how things were. These oral traditions contain information found nowhere else. Personal experience, local knowledge, perspectives that won't exist in books. When they die, that knowledge dies unless someone preserves it. Learn traditional arts and crafts from your community. Take classes from masters before they age past teaching. These skills represent centuries of refinement, solutions to local conditions, beauty created within constraints. They're worth preserving, not as museum pieces, but as living practices. Back up digital information in physical form. Print important documents. Write down essential knowledge. Digital storage is convenient but fragile. Formats change. Companies disappear. Data corrupts. Physical backup ensures crucial information survives system failures. Teach. This matters more than learning. Knowledge preserved in one mind dies with that person. Knowledge transmitted to 5 minds multiplies, spreads, survives. Become the teacher, the mentor, the elder who passes wisdom forward. Formal or informal doesn't matter. Teach neighbor to grow food. Show friend traditional craft. Explain concepts to curious children with respect for their intelligence. Every transmission strengthens the chain. Develop wisdom alongside knowledge. Practice meditation or contemplative traditions. These develop self-awareness, emotional regulation, the capacity to observe your own thinking. Study ethics and philosophy, not to find answers, but to develop judgment about using knowledge well. Cultivate connection with nature. Understand ecological relationships. See yourself as part of larger systems. Recognize patterns that transcend human timescales. Think long-term. Consider implications of choices for future generations. Develop care for people you'll never meet. Expand temporal awareness beyond your lifetime. Build community resilience. Knowledge preserves best collectively. Create local networks of people with diverse skills. Start community gardens where people share food and knowledge. Establish tool libraries where equipment gets shared rather than duplicated. Develop skill-sharing systems where everyone teaches something they know. Build local alternatives for food, water, energy that don't depend entirely on fragile global systems. This isn't paranoid isolation. This is healthy community development that strengthens society, whether catastrophe comes or not. It creates connection, reduces vulnerability, distributes knowledge, builds networks of mutual support. You're continuing the Atlantean mission. They scattered across the world, teaching, building, preserving. That project continues. It continues through everyone who chooses to value knowledge over convenience, wisdom over efficiency, long-term thinking over short-term gain. Every person who learns traditional skill and teaches it becomes part of that lineage. Every person who documents oral history preserves memory. Every person who thinks beyond their lifetime contributes to civilizational continuity. This might sound grandiose, comparing yourself to legendary survivors. But that's the point. They were just people facing crisis who responded with wisdom and courage. We face similar challenges. The question is whether we'll respond with similar dedication, whether we value knowledge enough to protect it, whether we think beyond ourselves to what we're passing forward. Becoming a knowledge keeper isn't achieving perfect self-sufficiency. It's conscious participation in transmission. Learn one skill deeply and teach 5 people. Document one elder's story before it's lost. Develop one wisdom practice and share it with others. Each act matters. Each transmission strengthens the chain. The survivor's greatest success might have been creating a culture that valued knowledge, keeping across generations. We can participate in that culture. We can see ourselves as links in chain spanning thousands of years. We can take up the responsibility they modeled. They couldn't save their civilization, but they saved their knowledge. You can too. But what about the bigger questions? About belief, skepticism, and truth. How should we hold these ideas? Some listeners are convinced. The pattern is too clear, the evidence too consistent, the framework too explanatory. They believe Atlantis was real, and survivors seeded civilization. Others remain skeptical. Interesting ideas, insufficient proof, too many gaps, conventional explanations adequate. Most probably fall somewhere between, intrigued, seeing patterns worth investigating, not ready for full commitment. All these responses are valid. Belief implies certainty, commitment to truth claim. Entertainment implies holding ideas as possibilities, useful frameworks without requiring certainty. Ancient mystery schools understood this distinction. They taught through paradox and myth rather than dogma, cultivating capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, developing comfort with uncertainty. Perhaps entertaining ideas, remaining open while maintaining skepticism, is more valuable than either rigid belief or dismissal. The Atlantean hypothesis organizes anomalies into coherent pattern. It offers practical wisdom about knowledge preservation, cyclical thinking, resilience. It encourages questioning mainstream narratives and considering alternatives. These utilities have value regardless of whether Atlantis literally existed as Plato described. Mainstream academia requires extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Reasonable standard. The Atlantean hypothesis hasn't met that burden for most scholars. No underwater city definitively located. No clear Atlantean artifacts identified. Conventional explanations exist for most anomalies. But absence of definitive proof isn't proof of absence. Many discoveries once dismissed as impossible are now accepted fact. The Atlantic remains largely unexplored. Conventional explanations might be wrong. The narration suggests holding space for unknown, neither requiring proof to consider possibility, nor considering it proven without proof. Different people can relate to these ideas differently, all appropriately. Scholars might treat it as hypothesis worth investigating, directing research toward overlooked evidence. Practitioners might adopt ancient wisdom techniques regardless of their origin story. If meditation works, does it matter whether Atlanteans practiced it? Preppers might view it as framework for understanding risks and preparing sensibly. Philosophers might engage with metaphysical and epistemological questions it raises. Artists might use it as creative inspiration without literal commitment. This documentary's intention wasn't proving anything definitively. It was presenting patterns worth considering, inviting re-examination of assumptions, showing that alternative narratives exist that explain available evidence. Whether Atlantis was real or not, the patterns discussed, advanced ancient knowledge, cyclical catastrophes, importance of wisdom and preparation, have value. Skeptics might say this cherry-picks evidence, ignores alternative explanations. promotes pseudoscience. Fair criticisms, perhaps. But mainstream narratives also cherry-pick, also ignore anomalies that don't fit, also resist paradigm shifts that threaten established understanding. The point isn't blind acceptance. It's mindful consideration. The healthiest relationship with these ideas might be curiosity without closure, staying open to evidence, willing to update beliefs as new information emerges, avoiding rigid positions in either direction. The ancient mysteries weren't meant to be solved but lived with, questions that transform those who engage them rather than answers that close investigation. Perhaps the question, did Atlantis exist? And did survivors build our civilizations? Is valuable precisely because it doesn't have easy answer. It keeps us questioning, investigating, considering alternatives to comfortable narratives. The mystery has value beyond any definitive solution. Maybe truth isn't binary. Maybe it's layered. Something happened around 9600 BCE that catastrophically changed human civilization. Survivors of something scattered with knowledge. Myths preserve distorted memories of real events. The Atlantis story is one culture's version of global trauma. Specific details may be mythologized, but the pattern is real. We might never know with certainty what exactly happened, but we can recognize that conventional history is incomplete, that ancient wisdom deserves respect as potential knowledge rather than dismissal as primitive superstition, that we're part of cycles older and larger than we imagined. That recognition has value whether or not we can prove the specific Atlantean hypothesis. The truth might not be about proving or disproving. It might be about learning to see what the mysteries are showing us, about developing capacity to hold complexity without needing certainty, about cultivating wisdom to work with partial knowledge rather than demanding complete answers. The Atlantean survivors, if they existed, encoded their knowledge in ways that revealed progressively as civilizations advanced. Maybe the ultimate encoded message is this: seek truth, but don't let certainty prevent you from engaging with mystery. Preserve knowledge, but recognize you'll never know everything. Build wisely, but accept that some questions remain open. Maybe the truth isn't about proving or disproving. It's about learning to see what the mysteries are showing us. So as we reach the end of this journey, what do we take with us? We started with anomalies and questions, explored ancient civilizations and their mysteries, examined evidence and patterns, considered warnings and wisdom. We arrive not at definitive answers, but at deeper questions and richer understanding. This is appropriate. The most important truths don't close investigation. They open it. They don't end curiosity. They deepen it. What have we learned, regardless of what we believe? Ancient civilizations were more sophisticated than typically acknowledged. Knowledge is fragile, vanishing quickly when transmission breaks. Human history might be much longer and more complex than conventional timelines suggest. Civilizations rise and fall in cycles influenced by both human choices and natural catastrophes. Wisdom, how to use knowledge well, matters as much as knowledge itself. Indigenous and traditional cultures maintain valuable knowledge. Modern society dismisses. We're part of vaster human story than our individual lives, or even our civilization's time span. These insights have value whether Atlantis literally existed as described. The Atlantean story is mythologically true, even if historically uncertain. It captures real patterns: catastrophic collapse, knowledge preservation, survivor diaspora, teaching across cultures, civilization rising from ruins. Whether there was a specific place called Atlantis, or whether the story represents multiple events compressed into single narrative, the archetypal truth remains. Civilizations fall. Knowledge must be preserved. Survivors teach. Humanity rebuilds. This cycle has happened, is happening, will happen. The Atlantis story gives it name and face and narrative that helps us understand and remember. Did Atlantis survivors build what we call history? Perhaps better question is, do we have the wisdom to ensure our civilization contributes to what future generations will call history? We're always both inheritors and ancestors, both students and teachers, both recipients of knowledge from past and trustees of knowledge for future. Whether we descend from Atlantean survivors or not, we face the same challenges. How to preserve what matters through chaos and change. How to teach wisdom alongside knowledge. How to think beyond individual lives to civilizational timescales. How to prepare for catastrophes while hoping they don't come. Human story is defined by memory and forgetting both. We remember enough to build on what came before. We forget enough that each generation rediscovers ancient truths as if they're new. The Atlantean survivors, if they existed, fought against forgetting, building monuments that would outlast memory, encoding knowledge that would survive cultural collapse, establishing traditions that would preserve wisdom across millennia. They succeeded partially. We've decoded some of what they left, lost much, still seeking to understand more. But their mission continues. It continues through anyone who values knowledge, who preserves wisdom, who teaches next generation, who thinks in deep time, who prepares for uncertain futures. When civilization began before it should have, when ancient peoples knew things they couldn't have figured out alone, when myths worldwide tell similar stories of teachers and catastrophes. These aren't just curiosities. These are pieces of our family history, clues to our origins, guides for our future. Whether literal or symbolic, whether proven or uncertain, the Atlantis story and the patterns it represents matter, because they tell us something true about human experience. We've been here before. We'll be here again. Knowledge is precious. Wisdom is essential. The story never truly ends. It just transforms. Like civilizations cycling through rise and fall. Like survivors scattering to teach new generations. Like the eternal return of all things. As you drift towards sleep, carrying these thoughts and patterns, you're participating in ancient tradition of story, memory, knowledge transmission. The mysteries remain mysterious. The questions remain open. But you're part of the ongoing human project of seeking truth, preserving wisdom, building something that outlasts individual lives. That's what the Atlantean survivors did. That's what we all do when we engage with knowledge and wonder. The story continues through us, through you, through everyone who questions and seeks and remembers. The monuments still stand, encoding their messages. The myths still circulate, carrying their memories. The cycle still turns, following its ancient pattern. And we stand at our particular moment in that vast pattern, carrying forward what those before us preserved, preparing what those after us will need. The inheritance is real. The choice is ours. The story never ends. Maybe we're not solving the mystery. Maybe we're part of it, playing our role in the pattern that never ends.